Yeah, just about as crazy as the title sounds. My dad is what they call a macho man. All he wanted was sons. He lived and breathed for another Keller boy. Naturally, when my older brother was born, he was overjoyed. 3 years later, he begged my mom to have another son. When he found out we were twins, he was excited to have 3 sons. So when my brother and I came out, and he saw that I was a girl, he was despaired. I've always been his least favorite kid, and he never tried to hide it. While he named my brothers Anthony and David, which means priceless and beloved, respectfully, he named me Lilith, which literally means night monster. While my brothers and mom tried to soften that direct punch to the gut by calling me Lily, he insisted on us all calling me Lilith, so I could feel the disappointment that he felt the day I was born. Clearly, he and my mom didn't stay together, and quite unfortunate, he signed for full custody when Anthony was 5, and David and I too. Things just got worse from there. If he took Anthony and David out to eat or to see a movie, I was to stay home. He spent all his time playing sports with my brothers and wouldn't let me join, even though I, as a girl, actually showed a genuine interest in what he was doing with my brothers. When I was 4, Dad got cancer, and from what I heard, it was supposed to be terminal. That's where the title of this story comes into play. Yeah, he made a deal with Satan. 15 years of life if he sold one of his children's souls. And big surprise, he chose me. So once I die, it's off to hell, no matter how little I sin or how much I pray. The first time I remember something happening to me was about a month after my dad made that deal. I was in my tiny, cramped room, trying to sleep on a bed I outgrew years ago, while my brothers and dad watched a movie downstairs. When I saw it, this thing in my closet, it was pale, with gaunt sunken eyes and a gaping mouth. Its long and bony fingers wrapped around my closet door. There was no question that this thing was a demon. I immediately cried for my dad, who stormed up the stairs and gave me a proper beating for interrupting his movie night with his kids. After that, he called me a little girl for crying and locked me in my room. As I cried all that night, the demon simply watched me from the closet, unmoving. Demons watching me were pretty normal from then on. Sometimes, it would be the pale, gaunt thing in my closet. Other times, a dark figure hovering over my bed. And on bad nights, a horned figure with glowing red eyes that would stare at me, taunting me through my window. After a while, I stopped being scared of them. One night, when I was 9, the gaunt creature was back in my closet, staring at me while I read. He began to make this really weird growling noise, to which I shushed him. He then did something he never did before. While he would occasionally wrap his hand around my slightly ajar door, he never actually came out of my closet. Until that night. In one swift movement, he tore open my closet door and stood up fully, revealing he was taller than the ceiling itself. He bent his neck in an abnormal way to fit under the roof. I rightfully should have been terrified at this moment, but for some reason, I just wasn't that scared. We locked eyes for a while, which was more awkward than scary, so I just went back to reading my book. He just looked at me curiously for a while, until my dad decided he wanted to be a horrible person again, and threw open my door to yell at me for one thing or another. The entire time, the demon just watched. Thankfully, my dad left after slapping me across the face, but I was crying again for the rest of the night. The demon, who now looked at me with something more than curiosity, looked back at my closed door, trying to see my dad. As I did nothing but sob, the demon just sat down beside my bed, towering over me. Neither of us looked at each other for the rest of the night. I cried while he just stared off in the distance. But I wasn't alone, and that was all I cared about. From then on, things changed. I wasn't just not scared of the demons, I welcomed them, especially the gaunt-looking one who sat by me that night. He would sit with me whenever my dad was bad to me, or whenever I had boy troubles at school. He never talked to me, and barely ever looked at me, but all I cared about was the fact that he was there for me. I even gave him a name. Papa. I remembered this one night. I was 14, and upset because Jacob, the boy I liked, didn't invite me to the Valentine's Day dance at our school. On top of that, my dad had gotten into one of his moods and had thrown a chair at me. When I ran to my room, I was almost relieved to see Papa crouched by the closet. "Papa," I cried, running to him. It was stupid, I know. I was calling a literal demon Papa, but I had nobody else. He was the only one who had ever shown me any sympathy. At first, he stepped back, but as I cried even harder, he looked at me in the eyes, maybe for the first time since that night he stepped out of the closet. Then, he did something surprising. He hugged me back. As I felt his icy cold hands wrap around me, I should have been terrified, but I was filled with love. Love for finally finding a dad who loved me. But one night, as I was reading To Kill a Mockingbird for my school project, I made a mistake. Papa looked curious, so I decided to read out loud to him. I guess I made too much noise though, because David opened up my door. "Lilith, who the hell are you?" What the hell is that?" he screamed. My dad came rushing up. Papa couldn't hide in time. And now, Anthony, David, and my dad all stared him down. He stood up, revealing his giant stature, and David began to cry, while Anthony froze in place, and my dad ran off to get a vial of holy water he had kept by his bed ever since the deal was made. As I tried to run away with Papa, he stopped me and shook his head. We both knew it was too late. I cried as I hugged him goodbye. And as my dad approached us with the holy water and sprayed it on Papa, he let out a blood-curdling screech that could have been heard across the country. I watched in horror as Papa, who had stayed by my side all of these years, faded to nothingness. "There," Dad said. "It can't hurt us anymore, boys," he said, embracing David and Anthony in a hug. I just laid over Papa's lifeless body, uncontrollably sobbing. We were all so caught up in our own worlds that we didn't notice something came up behind us. He was large, even bigger than Papa, and had two large horns, a goat's head, and a large stick in his hand. Dad turned around slowly, looking to this thing as he glared down at my abuser. "Your Majesty, We had a deal, Stanley. I granted you 15 more years of life on 2 conditions." "2!" It boomed, and I noticed David had wet himself. "It was a misunderstanding, sir. My daughter..." "You were granted 15 more years of life on the conditions that I get your daughter upon her death, and you never harm anyone ever again. Do you understand? It asked. Yes, and I promise, I haven't done anything. The creature laughed. First you break a promise, and now you lie? To his satanic majesty himself? Seeing you have not only harmed your daughter her entire life, but have killed one of my best minions, you have broken my trust. I'm breaking the deal off. My dad got down on his knees. No, please, I'll do anything, he begged. Satan looked at me. There is one way. If Lilith, your daughter, and the one you cursed, if she forgives you, I'll set you free, and you'll live the rest of your life. My dad slowly turned to me and put on a smile. Hey, Lily, what about it? Look at me. I'm your dad, your papa. I raised you. Don't you love me? I'm your dad, for Christ's sake, he said, getting more agitated as I stared at him. It's up to you, Lilith, Satan said. I looked to Papa's body on the floor, then back to my dad. Come on, you gonna believe Satan or your dear old dad? My dad said, pleading to me. I glared at him. My dad's dead. You killed him, I said. I don't forgive you. And with that, Satan dragged my dad down to the netherworld, my brothers and I hearing his screams, until he was far away enough that it faded, to where he could never hurt me again. As my brothers cried in the loss of their dad, I walked back to Papa on the ground and kissed his forehead. Goodbye, Papa. Thank you. If I timed the 911 call just right, the paramedics could revive me before I kicked the bucket for good. At least, that was the hope. Any number of things could go wrong, especially when it came to asphyxiation. I didn't want to die, per se. I just needed a way in, and this was the only thing I could come up with, however foolish a plan it may have been. I better be careful about this. Charlotte would never forgive me if I died this way. Get yourself in there and stick to the plan. Before I could talk myself out of it, I dialed the number, gave the operator my address, and told her what I was about to do. After the call, I inhaled a deep, preparatory breath, placed the bag over my head, secured it around my neck, and then released the valve on the helium tank. Maybe it wasn't the best way to go about taking my own life, but it sure as hell beat slicing my arms up and praying the ambulance would arrive before I bled out. As a bonus, it would be completely painless, like falling asleep, if my research was to be believed. As the gas filled the plastic bubble around my head, my vision began wavering. Darkness crept around my eyes, and soon filled my entire field of view. Within moments, I lost consciousness. The last thing I remember was the faint sensation of my body going limp and my head falling against the back of the armchair. This was it. I only hoped it wouldn't be the end of me. For what seemed like an eternity, there was nothing but blackness, just an endless void that lacked any and all light. That's how I perceived it anyway. It's possible I was just seeing the black of my eyelids from a gurney on its way through the emergency room. I just knew I was conscious, at least in some fashion, but with no access to my physical body. an orb of awareness floating through a sea of nothing. Panic overtook me as I drifted. What if there is no afterlife? What if I die and this is all there is to it? Am I doomed to remain this way forever? These worries were soon put to rest by a dim white light visible in the distance. It grew larger in size as the moments passed, indicating that it was getting closer, or that I was getting closer to it. Before long, it enveloped me, bringing with it a soothing warmth, the likes of which I had never felt before. The feeling subsided almost as quickly as it came, and the light disappeared, revealing my new surroundings. I was in a white room with a single door at one of its walls. Not white really. I suppose blank is a better word for it. Like a brightness with no color. It seemed to breathe as well. The walls, the floor, they expanded and contracted as translucent waves of glowing energy resonated around them. The only dissonance was the view above. No roof or ceiling, just pitch black as far as the eye could see. Seeing as the door was my only viable means of progressing, I gathered my wits and approached it. To my surprise, before I could even reach for the handle, it opened, and a man stepped out from within. "Hello, Jack." He was an older gentleman, late 50s, gray hair and mustache. "How do you know me?" I asked, alarmed by his arrival. He snickered a bit before replying. "Oh, Jack, I've known you for quite some time, and I know exactly why you're here." He snapped his fingers and they appeared on either side of him. My wife and daughter. "Charlotte, Leslie." I took a step forward, but the man put out his hand to stop me. "They can't hear you, Jack. They are shells of their former selves." I wasn't quite following. What the hell is going on here? How do you know me? What have you done with my wife and daughter? "You're a lucky man, Jack. I'm going to tell you everything. Secrets no mortal was ever meant to know." He leaned in a bit before divulging his truths. "Your kind call us guardian angels, but we don't protect you. We just observe and make sure things go according to plan. You are the 3 I've been assigned to since Leslie's birth. It used to be 1 per human, but there are less of us now than ever before. Now it's 1 to a family." Confusion washed over me as my mouth opened, but no words came out in response. In truth, I didn't know what to say. And this, if you haven't guessed by now, is what you humans so lovingly refer to as heaven. The afterlife, if you will. An assortment of rooms, each with their own deceased. It's a glorified museum of souls, really. Looking down at my battered wife and daughter, my patience wore thin. "That doesn't explain what you've done to my family." He threw me an arrogant smile. "When a person's been here long enough, we take their life force, extracting every last remnant of their soul." "And then what? What do you do with the souls you take?" I asked. His lip curled up a bit before answering. "We devour them. You humans need air, food, and water to live. We need souls. It's the only thing keeping us alive. That system of ours has been in place since the dawn of time, and will continue, long after the universe has folded in on itself. Charlotte and Leslie's tickets are up. I've been picking away at them bit by bit. It's a long and tedious process, one that's very unpleasant for the soul's host. They're damaged goods now." My blood boiled at every word that fell from his lips. Without hesitating, I took a swing at him. My fist met the side of his face, and then phased right through, like punching a ghost. "Nice try, Jack." My anger only grew. "Why are you even telling me any of this?" His face wrinkled into a more serious look. It's simple, really. I want your soul. Fresh meat is hard to come by these days. When a person dies, we have to wait to consume their essence, a grace period of sorts. From birth, all humans have a divine protection on their souls, a bothersome trait of your evolution. It lingers, even after death. We can only feed after it wears off. By dinner time, the soul is stale and tasteless, barely enough to maintain our strength. We're like vampires feeding on cows. Then how do you plan on taking mine? His face lit up at that question. You're a curious case, Jack. Taking one's own life is the only thing that voids that pesky barrier. That means your soul is now available for consumption. Unfortunately, even we have rules. He no longer looked so enthused. Meaning what exactly? I asked. You're not dead. Not completely. There's still a chance you'll be saved. That means, while you're here in this cross-section of life and death, I can't retrieve your soul, not without your consent. He couldn't touch me, not without my permission. That one fact gave me hope that the current could still shift in my favor. It was something I could potentially use to my advantage. So what is this then? You want me to just hand it over? Why on earth would I ever agree to that? He smiled and looked down at Leslie and Charlotte. These are, what's the phrase? My bargaining chips. My eyes widened and my heart sank. I was undoubtedly fearful for their safety in all of this. Whatever he was up to, he certainly had my attention now. I know all about your haphazard rescue mission, but it was doomed from the start. Even if you somehow managed to escape with them, they have no bodies to return to. They were cremated after the accident. Hell, if I didn't show up when you arrived, you would have never found them in this godforsaken maze. It's larger than the universe itself. He was right. It was my desire, all along, to bring them back with me. But I didn't have much of a plan after getting in. The idea was to find whoever was in charge and beg them for help. I thought, at the very least, I would be allowed to communicate with them and make sure they were okay. Maybe even ask for their forgiveness. So what are you saying? You can give them their bodies back? Make them alive again? That's not possible. Look at them, Jack. They're well past dead. Not even I have the power to rectify what's been done. I took a closer look. Charlotte adorned a pair of empty eyes and pale skin, stuck in a zombie-like stupor. Even Leslie, who had always been so vibrant and full of life when she was alive, was now still. As still as she was on that slab in the morgue after the accident. I looked away, tears now rolling down my cheeks. I just wanted to bring them back. My wife and my sweet little girl. It was my job to protect them, and I failed. I'm the only one who did this. I was the one behind the wheel. It should have been me instead. I'm so sorry. It should have been me. The man interjected. I can offer you a ceasefire of sorts. If you agree to let me absorb your soul, your family here will get a little break. Let's say 100 years before their final extraction. It was probably a good deal, but I couldn't bear the thought of my family being hurt in any way, even if it wasn't for another century. No. He placed his hand on his chin in contemplation, before dislocating it and tossing me a stern look. Okay, how about 1,000? That wasn't good enough. He needed something I had. So long as that was true, I could haggle for something better, like my family's freedom. I want them alive again. If you can do that, we have a deal. He scoffed at my counteroffer. Even if their souls were in perfect condition and bodies unscathed, resurrection is not an option. It's far outside of the range of my capabilities. I glared at him in disbelief. How do I know you're telling the truth? You don't have to believe me, Jack, but I'm not lying. 1,000 years is the best I can do. Take it, or leave it. Maybe he was being honest. Even so, I didn't like the offer. If I accepted, I would be knowingly throwing my wife and daughter's souls to the beast. They would be chewed up and swallowed like table scraps. No, I couldn't let that happen. No. The man let out a sigh of disappointment. He then waltzed over and put a condescending hand on my shoulder. Come on, Jack. Can't you put your family first for once? My hands were now clenched and the tips of my nails almost breaking skin. I took another swing, but much like before, my hand passed right through with no restraint whatsoever. He was toying with me and knew just what buttons to push. How dare you? How dare you stand there and judge me when you're the one tormenting innocent people, leveraging 2 lives to bargain for a better meal? It's about survival, Jack. A fresh soul like yours could keep me alive for 1,000 years. I can't afford to be empathetic when my very existence is on the line. I turned away, completely disgusted, but half considering this offer. It was, after all, the only one on the table. Even if they were going to have their souls desecrated, I could at least delay the inevitable. You know what, Jack? I'm gonna make you a final offer. Your family gets 1,000 years, and in addition, you will get a severance package. While your soul is being ripped apart from your vessel, I will put you in a trance. You won't feel any pain. You'll be locked away in your own memories, free to relive the best moments of your life, again and again, until your time is up. I stood silent for a moment, thinking it over. I like you, Jack. I really do. This could be beneficial for the both of us. Here, let me show you. The man placed a hand on my forehead. In an instant, the room faded, and I was transported into my car. Driving down the back roads of our old neighborhood, Charlotte and Leslie in the back seat, looking out the window at the Christmas lights. It was a memory of mine from last winter. Just then, the man from heaven appeared in the passenger seat. This is one of my favorites. You were so happy back then. What the hell are you doing here? I asked. Don't worry, Jack. They can't see me. I'm in total control. Please, Jack, humor me. Look at them. I stole a glimpse of Charlotte and Leslie through the rearview mirror. They were smiling, happily looking out at all the decorated houses. It wasn't really my wife and daughter, just a memory, but it felt so good to see them like this. It was peaceful. I can make it feel like years in here, Jack. Just say the words, and it's all yours. It was a tempting offer, more than tempting actually. It took every fiber in me not to accept right then and there. The only thing I wanted more than to live in a fantasy like this was the real thing. More than that, I wanted my family to be safe. Why can't you just let them go? I'll give you my soul. I just want them to be safe. I told you, Jack, it's not within my power. The souls have been thoroughly shredded. And whose fault is that? I yelled. He shook his head in disapproval. Yours, if I remember it correctly. You're the one who swerved off the road and killed your family. I was just feeding to stay alive. Survival is a basic instinct that isn't unique to just humans, you know? We sat quiet for the rest of the ride, both seething with anger. Once the memory ran its course, and I pulled into our driveway at home, the man turned to me and placed his hand on my forehead again, putting me in another memory. This time, I was in a hospital. "Push! Push!" I heard Charlotte screaming, and all at once it came back to me. This was the day Leslie was born. Beautiful, isn't it? Gross, but beautiful. The man from heaven was now at my side, watching the moment unfold. After all was said and done, a nurse came over and handed me a newborn Leslie. "Congratulations, sir. It's a girl." She didn't cry. Instead, her eyes opened. She took one look up at me and then placed her tiny hand on my chest. She was mine, and I was hers. My little girl. In the years that passed since this day, I had almost forgotten how much this moment affected me. This was, without a shadow of a doubt, the happiest day of my life. The man from heaven placed a hand on my back and offered me a smile. "Congratulations, Jack." I looked back down at Leslie, but she was gone. And looking up, the whole room was now empty. No doctors, nurses, or staff. All life had vanished from the hospital. There was just me, the man, and a harrowing silence. He sat down on the hospital bed where Charlotte had just given birth. "These precious moments are all you have left now. You should take them while you still can." A single tear fell from my face. It started happy, rolling down my cheek at the sight of my daughter, so precious and loving. It ended sad when she disappeared, grazing my chin and hitting the floor with a heartbreaking splash. It reminded me of the day she was taken from me, the day I lost both of them. "What'll it be, Jack? The clock is ticking." It was probably the best offer I could get, but the image of Charlotte and Leslie, lifeless and broken, stayed with me. If there were ever a moment to fight for my family, this was it. Save my wife and daughter, and I'm yours. The man's face turned sour as he stood up and marched over to me. "I have just about had it with you. Do you know how many people in the world would die for an offer like this? You killed yourself for your family, and you can't even lift a finger to help them in their time of need." "I am helping them. It's simple. You need my soul, and I need their safety. Not for a finite period of time, and not in here. Down there, on Earth, far away from things like you. Figure out how to make it happen, or no deal." His lips contorted into a mad grin. "You know what? I have a better deal." He placed his hand on my forehead once more and transported us to another memory. This one was all too familiar. No, it can't be. Charlotte was in the passenger seat. Through the rearview mirror, I saw the man sitting in the back, next to Leslie. "Oh yes, Jack, it can. This is the night you killed your family." I immediately attempted to stop the car, but my body's movements were out of my control. "No, you can't do this." "Of course I can. Now pipe down. I'm trying to watch the show." Eventually, I swerved and we crashed into that damn tree. That cold pillar of wood whose image would forever be etched into my mind, plaguing my every nightmare. The sound of my daughter's screams echoed all around, before giving way to the shattering glass and the loud crunch of deforming metal. The abrupt silence that followed was sickening. Just as I had on the day in question, I craned my neck back and saw Leslie, covered in blood and shrapnel. Charlotte was even worse. Her airbag failed to go off, so she ricocheted off the windshield, breaking her neck. Her head was hunched over, bent farther back than I thought humanly possible. Shortly after witnessing the aftermath, I passed out, and the horror continued. I awoke in the car at the same moment as before. Charlotte was next to me, and Leslie was in the back seat, next to that twisted angel and his piercing smile. So, what'll it be, Jack? Take my offer, or relive this crash indefinitely. Even if the paramedics revive you down there on Earth, I can make this feel like a lifetime or more. You can have 1,000 years of peace for your wife and daughter, or 1,000 years of this. Can your fragile mind even handle that? Let's find out. The car swerved, my daughter screamed, and my family died. Then it all started again. Come on, Jack, just say yes. It's that simple. Give me your soul. No, I had to fight for them. They were worth the anguish. Save them, and you can have it. All right, Jack, have it your way. Swerve, screams, tree, death. It kept happening, an endless loop of torture. I must have experienced it over 50 times without pause. I wasn't sure if I could hold out much longer. I have to hand it to you, Jack. You have a formidable will on your side. Still, you will be crushed beneath the weight. It's just a matter of time. It must have been the 100th crash or so. It took me that long to notice it. I must have repressed the memory, or maybe it was knocked loose in the crash. But on this particular replay of events, out of the corner of my eye, I was able to catch a glimpse of what I was swerving to avoid. It was a man, standing in the middle of the road. There was something familiar about him, but I couldn't quite put my finger on what. A dozen more crashes came and went, each more devastating than the last. To distract myself from the pain of losing my family again and again, I focused on that man in the road, trying desperately to identify what it was I recognized about him. It was difficult in the pandemonium, his outline distant and out of focus, but eventually, it came to me. I knew exactly where I had seen him before. Another loop started. I'm growing bored of this, Jack. Let's strike a deal and just be done with it. It was you. You were the one standing in the road. You're the one I was trying to avoid when I swerved. It was you, the whole time. Looking at him through the mirror, I watched him become visibly nervous when I finally put the pieces together. Like I said, Jack, survival. If I waited any longer for any of you to die, I would have perished myself. It was nothing personal. The car came to a stop, and my family vanished, leaving just me and him behind. What's going on? I asked. I turned to see him staring out the car window, defeated. This little outing of ours had been sanctioned with the higher-ups. They've been monitoring everything. I thought I tampered with your memory enough for you to forget. Now that you know, they know too. I'll have to stand trial. It won't be long before. In this moment, a beam of light penetrated the car and engulfed the man, effectively vaporizing him before my very eyes. A few flakes of ash danced through the air and settled on the seat below. Afterwards, another man appeared at my side in the passenger seat. Hello, Jack. How are you today? Startled, I fell back against the car door. "Who are you?" One of the higher-ups he was talking about. He pointed at the pile of ash in the back seat. "Is he dead?" I asked. "Yes, more dead than anything in this universe can be. In fact, I saw to it myself." Having seen what I just saw, I cowered a bit while conversing with this new danger. "May I ask why you killed him?" "Certainly. You see, Jack, he broke one of our cardinal rules. It's true that we feed on the souls of humans we're assigned, but no matter how hungry we get, we are not allowed to interfere in the natural order of things. You and your family were meant to live long lives, but he caused a premature disturbance, nudging your wife and daughter into the hereafter so he could feed." It was all becoming clear now. That man ruined my life. He was to blame for everything. He put self-preservation before our laws, and that can't go unpunished. No trial, no questions. Please, accept my apology on his behalf." A wave of anger overcame me as I sat upright to meet his gaze. "Apology? My wife and daughter are dead, and their souls are tarnished, all because you couldn't keep one of your own in line? Keep your apology. It means nothing to me." His friendly demeanor turned cold as I said this. "You know, people who speak to someone like me in that sort of tone usually end up like him." Again, he pointed to the back seat. I returned to a cowering position, realizing I may have just crossed a powerful celestial being. He sighed and then smiled. "It's okay, Jack. I will set things right." Like the man before him, he placed a hand on my forehead. After that, my sight was overtaken by a familiar darkness, a vast void where I could do nothing but drift. Then, I saw it. It was faint at first, but its glow became more visible as time went on. It was a light, and it soon enveloped me. I awoke in a hospital, the rhythmic pang of my pulse emanating from a monitor at the side of the bed. Did he bring me back? A nurse passed by the room and did a double take before entering. "Oh my gosh, you're awake!" She dashed over to my IV and replaced the fluids while checking my vitals on the monitor. "How long was I out?" "Oh, about 3 days or so." "Only 3 days?" It felt a hell of a lot longer. "You're going to be on suicide watch after that stunt you pulled, just to forewarn you." "It beats being dead, I guess." "You've got that right, mister." I hadn't fully gathered my composure yet, but the nurse's next words woke me right up. "Oh, you have some visitors. It's your wife and daughter." "Charlotte and Leslie? What? But how?" "I'll send them in." A few minutes later, I saw them. My heart nearly stopped right then and there. "Jack!" Charlotte ran over and pulled me into a tight embrace. Leslie followed behind her. "We missed you, Daddy." I don't have words for how I felt. They were back, my family, in my arms again. Is this really happening? How are you here? "It was some man, Jack. He came and patched us up, and then just sent us back. It's like we never left." She was crying, happy tears, not sad ones. "It's a miracle, Jack." I took them in my arms and cried too. An enormous smile stretched across my face. This was now the happiest day of my life. I finally had my girls back, and I wouldn't let anyone or anything take them away ever again. Whenever that day does come, and we have to move on to the next world, I will be prepared. Mark my words. Somehow, I will find a way to protect their souls from harm. No one will ever lay a hand on my family. Not while I'm around. I won't allow it. The house was right where it should be, and hardly stood out at all. It was built exactly the same as the rest, made of red brick and single story with the basement, and based on the window just above the foyer, an attic, not quite tall enough to stand in. "Better get inside," said Alan Wickett from beside me. His tall, slender frame against the sunset in the middle of December. It blended in well enough with the silhouettes of barren trees and their spindly branches. Best not to keep it waiting. It? I thought to myself. He? I wasn't sure what to think. I can tell you right now that no matter what I had on my mind, my train of thought would have derailed hard into a brick wall when the door opened. The smell of rot wafted out and stabbed at my olfactory sense with prejudice. A sign, perhaps, of things to come. Alan stepped in first, his gray suit pants a bit too long, and now stained with mud, left a pair of tracks on the tile floor covered in footpads and rugs. The kitchen was where it really hit me. "So, this is where you'll be spending the night. I'd apologize, but everyone has to do it at least once. You're familiar with the ground rules?" Alan's beady eyes examined me closely, followed every strand of hair and every bead of sweat as I looked at my partner for the evening. Situated at the end of the dinner table was a boy illuminated by the soft orange glow of a cast iron stove. He couldn't have been older than 8 or 9 years, and he was very much dead. His eyes had sunken deep into his skull and left black empty sockets behind. They were barely distinguishable against the dark, violet-tinged flesh that had become bloated with rot and stained by dirt thrown upon not one, but 2 graves. He didn't appreciate being buried the second time, which is how we got to today. He was dressed in a plaid shirt and overalls, both of which had been cleaned. It wouldn't do to come to dinner dressed like the Walking Dead, even though he couldn't do much to help it. I nodded at Alan, but I didn't say a word. He took the hint and proceeded to explain. "You will not proceed to leave this room, the kitchen, for any reason at any time throughout the evening," he began, taking out a handkerchief to dab the sweat from his forehead. "And you will keep the fire going throughout the evening as well. It doesn't like the cold." He sighed. "Further, you will not sleep, nor take your eyes off it for any extended period of time. You are permitted to eat what's in the fridge, an assortment of cold cuts and soft drinks or bottled water. We do not encourage you to drink anything that comes from the house itself. All things considered, we don't know why it came back or what caused it, and it could be something to do with the house. Maybe it just wanted to come home again, but..." He stopped to see if I had broken out of my stupor. Then he walked over to the boy at the end of the table and knelt down. "This is the only way to keep it here for now." Sensing that I was perhaps a little frightened, Alan decided to perform a demo. He snapped his fingers in front of the dead kid's face. He whispered into his ear, Hey, can you hear me?" But predictably, He received no response. He filled a glass with water and poured it on the kid's head. Nothing. "See?" he said, hands firmly on his hips. "As long as you follow the rules, it's as good as dead." I smiled, looking at him. It just might turn out to be an easy night after all, so long as I followed the rules. Alan shook my hand, gave me thanks, and left me with keys to lock up in the morning. All the while I kept my eyes fixed upon my dinner date. It wasn't too hard once you got past the fact that you were looking at a rotten corpse. I fed the fire every now and again. It was hot. My back was sticky with sweat, and I wiggled around in the chair across the table for a long time. I swayed my head back and forth, kicked my legs, and tapped my fingers to the tune of the water coming out of the sink. Apparently, Alan had forgotten to turn it off all the way, so every second it seemed another drop came down and struck the aluminum on the bottom, letting out a hollow echo. Drip, tap, drip, tap, drip, tap. It went on like this for a while. There was a clock above the dead kid, but it had stopped working a long time ago, around 4:47. I couldn't tell if it was AM or PM, but I could just about read the hands in the gentle light of the room. I thought about ways to check the time without a clock. Maybe I could see what the stars looked like outside and give it a good guess. I was always good at weird things like that, guessing the time based on where the sun was or whether I could see the North Star. But then I'd have to look away from the dead kid, but not for long. I mean, I could still blink, right? And it had to have been 3 hours, maybe 4 by now. I still had a while to go. It would be nice to know how long. Drip, tap, drip, tap, drip, tap. I decided I'd do it. Just a quick glance, nothing more. I took a few deep breaths. The kid's body was slouched down, like he was sliding off the chair. His jaw had frozen in place long ago, a little slack. I looked him in the eyes, the sockets, then threw my glance at the window. I moved too fast and couldn't see anything. Sweat was running down my face. I looked back at the kid. Nothing. He hadn't moved. All right, fine, I thought. We'll play that game. I got up from my chair and slowly walked over. Every step I took felt like it was being held back. I could hear my heartbeat ringing in my head. I was shaking by the time I got to the kid's body. But to be perfectly honest, I had been shaking since I got here. I put my arm out, my fingers stretched out and my palm exposed. I put my hand on his chest. The body was cold, but not freezing. There was no pulse, no heartbeat, no breath, nothing whatsoever. That's when I decided I'd take it a step further. I stepped back and leaned against the wall. The outside of the house was brick, but the inside was lined with drywall. I could feel the wall behind me give a little as I rested against it, and even more as I pushed myself off it and grabbed the kid by the shoulders. I pulled his body up from the slouching position and sat him up straight. I took a deep breath and said, "I'm going to look out the window for a minute. Don't move." I had no idea if that would work. I was frankly bluffing because this kid had already found its way back out of the grave, not once, but twice, and wandered to the house. Nobody knew if he would come out or what might happen if he did, but he never once moved when someone else was with him, watching. So this was the solution: to lock someone inside with him every night, and if I was going to be a part of the solution, then we were going to do it my way. I put him back down firmly and stepped back. I moved towards the sink, the dripping still coming every second, on the second, like clockwork. I bit my lip and turned around slowly, keeping my eyes on him until the very last minute before I looked outside. The sky was beautiful. Being out in a small town, there wasn't much light pollution. The dark sky was covered in brilliant stars, like a dome set with rubies, emeralds, sapphires, and pearls. When I finally realized I had been staring out the window for a while and came to, I whipped around to find the kid sitting there. He hadn't moved. I sighed, leaned forward onto my knees, and said, "Good boy." I went over to feed the fire, grabbing a few logs and tossed them in. I watched through the glass door as they went up in flames. The soft glow gave way to a bright yellow one, and the warmth became a wall of heat that carried off the stove. The whole room was illuminated brightly now. My stomach started to growl a while later, so I carefully made my way to the pantry and got a plate and some bread. I grabbed some for the kid too, because why not? Maybe he was hungry too. It would be impolite either way. When I got back to the room, he was still there, just as I left him. "Hungry?" I asked. The stench of the place wasn't so much of a bother anymore. At least, I had gotten kind of used to the smell. I pulled out some bologna and turkey. The only kind of cheese was Swiss, and that would have to do. There was milk, which I poured into a glass for the kid, and I myself grabbed a fizzy drink. "Here you go, bologna and cheese with milk. Enjoy it," I said as I sat down and ate my own turkey sandwich. I lathered it in mustard in the hopes that I could accommodate anything but the taste of stale, rotten air that permeated through the house. I got up and began to wash the dishes. While I was doing so, I started to feel tired. I became more and more relaxed. That was until I heard a loud thud. It was more of a thump-thump and a slam. I whipped around hard and fast enough to break my neck and fixed my eyes on the kid. He was in the exact place I left him, but my hands were shaking furiously anyway. I walked over slowly, carefully, and snapped my fingers in his face. Nothing. Then I saw it. A log had fallen off the pile. I sighed, threw it into the stove, and went back to wash the dishes. The sky was turning now. It had become a dark but noticeably more pale blue color. Closing in on 4 in the morning, I figured. My eyes trailed up the window into the sky, and then just above the window on the wall inside the house. Right to a splotch on the wall, if only a little out of place. A splotch shaped like a child's footprint covered in mud, and just ahead of it was another, and another, and another, and handprints too. I started following the trail around the ceiling and the edges of the wall, along the crown molding and into the corners. I started trembling again. Were these always here? How did I not notice them before? I looked over at the kid. He was slumped down in his chair. I rushed over to the fridge. I tore everything out and threw it on the floor, then turned to face the kid. He was still slumped over. I ripped out the shelves, even the drawers. I picked up the kid's body and stuffed it inside. Then I closed the door, pinned the chair against it, and sat over by the furnace. I curled up in a ball, trembling. I just had to make it a few more hours. Just a few more hours. At 6 a.m., they come and get you. At 6 a.m., they would come and get me. And until 6 a.m., that kid would be locked in the fridge. It occurred to me that after a short while, I should arm myself. I got up and went looking in the drawers for a knife, but the house didn't have anything of the sort. A precautionary measure? Perhaps. I kicked over a chair and stomped on it until the legs came off. Nice and dull, but still sharp enough to stab a rotting corpse. Perfect. I tried to keep my mind focused, but I had forgotten to turn off the sink like Alan had earlier. Drip tap, drip tap, drip tap. I got up and turned it off, and I heard it. Tap, 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 coming from the fridge. from inside the fridge, and that's when I realized it myself. I wasn't tapping with the sink. The dripping and the tapping were following a rhythm, a very peculiar rhythm, the rhythm of a beating heart. The tapping stopped. Now there was muffled sounds coming from inside. Weeping? I walked over to the fridge. The room felt like it was getting wider but shrinking. I felt trapped. The fire was blazing, and the walls were a golden color, having been covered in the light of a flame. I kicked the fridge. "Shut up in there," I said. The weeping died down. I slunk away and sat back down in the corner, my wooden spear gripped tightly between sweaty, clammy fingers. I heard something in the hall just outside the kitchen. Footsteps? Couldn't be, I thought. No way. I got up to look. I dared not leave the room. Nothing was out there. At least nothing I could see in the pitch black of the hall. I turned around quickly and looked at the fridge. The chair still held against the door. Nothing had changed. But I knew better than to believe my eyes anymore. In my undying desire to keep this kid where I felt he belonged, I refused to blink for a while. Sitting next to a raging fire, my eyes had become pained and dry. My head was throbbing. I just wanted to sleep and have some rest. I blinked finally, the first time in what felt like an hour. Then I blinked again. Then I blinked again. And that third time, I must admit I didn't open my eyes for a while. When I did, the fire had died down and the sun had begun to shine in through the windows. The chair was pinned against the fridge where I had left it, and there was banging on the front door. Finally, Alan had come. They had come and I could leave. I got up and spit on the fridge. I did my time, my one day, and I wasn't coming back. Someone else could get the corpse kid out of there. I walked down the hallway, which was still cloaked in soft shadow. "I'm coming," I yelled. "I'm gonna be there in a sec." I got to the door and yanked it open. There was nobody there. Every hair on my body stood on end. It was like I had been electrocuted or thrown into an ice bath straight after I'd fallen asleep. I turned around and ran toward the kitchen. The chair was still up against the fridge. I ripped it away and opened it. The kid was still inside. I dropped my face into my hands and wiped my eyes. I pinched my nose and took a deep breath. When I opened my eyes, the fridge door slammed shut in front of me. I fell back against the wood pile, kicking my legs out in front of me, with the broken chair leg extended forward. The sink was dripping again, and again came the tapping. Drip, tap, drip, tap, drip, tap. The heartbeat had returned to the house. That's when Alan walked in through the doorway to the kitchen. "So you made it," he said. "Didn't follow the rules though. It's alright. You're not the first. You won't be the last. We hope someone will one day." He guided me outside. There were a few other people out there, some cops and some paramedics just in case. Not sure if anyone ever needed them. "Listen, you'll want to keep the lights on the next few nights, and maybe sleep in the living room by the window. These guys out here will be outside your place for a bit." I looked up at Alan, curiously. "Why?" I asked, dreading the answer. "Well," he said, "it sometimes comes to visit ones it likes the most. Just a precaution, I'm sure." I thought to myself. "It?" I said out loud. "It," said Alan. As we walked back to my house, I looked up at the sky. I could see the faint flicker of stars as they faded in the morning. And in the glow of the sun, on the facades all around us, were tiny smudges, little footprints like you might expect from a child who had been playing in the mud. I grinned, and I gripped the leg of the chair a little tighter after. Only the ones it likes, I thought to myself. Only the ones it likes. I don't like to think about the hole at the end of the garden. Growing up, there were very few topics I couldn't breach with my family, but that hole was one of them. It's not an overly large hole, around 1.5 by 2 meters across, not overly deep either, but much darker than it should be. A dangerous trap only to a child, which, as I've experienced, is what makes the hole so dangerous. No doubt you've noticed it. It has a presence to it. It draws the eye. Our family had a lot of rules that we followed without much question. Normal ones like no sneaking out, no smoking, no junk food after 8 p.m. But we had some weird ones too. Like, never place the beds facing the windows that look out into the garden. We were never allowed to play in the yard unsupervised or allowed out there after dark. We had to wear earplugs from 6 to 12 years old while we slept. But the most important one was to never, ever look into the hole. I was embarrassingly old when I found out that not every household held these rules. I asked both my parents and grandparents who lived with us, once and only once, about the hole. Why not just cover it up or build a fence around it if they were so concerned with it? They were quiet for a while, and then my dad glanced out the window and said, "Doesn't work." The words weren't as nearly shocking as the fact that they came from him. My dad, handyman extraordinaire, who never backed down from a challenge, never gave up on anything. But he gave up on this. Why? I think that was the first time I began to realize that there was something wrong with that hole. It only got worse. I'm sure you've heard by now that there's an unusually high number of disappearances around these parts. Not frequent enough to alarm authorities, but if you were to look back through the decades, the numbers grow uncomfortably high. Did you read about them? Did any stick out to you? A pair of blue eyes, a face with a gorgeous grin? My grandfather never called them disappearances, despite the fact that no bodies were ever found. With every announcement, he would share a knowing glance with my grandmother over the morning newspaper. Coincidentally, we would receive with renewed gusto a stern lecture about keeping away from the hole. I never really believed him because it all just seemed so implausible. The disappearances had no pattern to them. It didn't discriminate. How could a grown adult fall down a barely 3-foot deep hole and disappear? What would possess them to come into our garden? The hole wasn't visible from the road. I entertained his lectures and avoided the hole, mostly due to the ingrained rule rather than genuine belief. Often, I wondered why our house, why our garden. There was nothing special about us or the land. No hidden mass graves or religious sites. It was just Earth. That's all it should have been. Until my cousin came to live with us. My Aunt Carol and little cousin Mike lived near the coast. After a particularly harsh winter, their home saw so much flood damage that the house was rendered unlivable. My dad and his sister were really close, so naturally, they came to live with us. I loved Mike. He was kind and funny. Even though he was only 8 years old, we were pretty close. He had a burning curiosity, though. That's where the trouble started. This was a particularly dark few years for my family. I only mention it in the hopes that if any of this starts to sound familiar, you'll do what we never did. Leave. It started really small. I would walk past his room and find him looking towards the window, mid-play, as if someone called his name. Then, standing up against the window, games abandoned. For longer and longer intervals, he would just stare. He would get extremely irritated if there was no adult around to supervise him playing in the yard. I never counted, even though I considered myself an adult. The irritation wouldn't have disturbed my family as much if anger hadn't been an unusual emotion for him. But it was. Mike was so calm. Very little ever bothered him. With Mike around, very little bothered anyone. So when he started scrunching his face with barely controlled anger and smashing his favorite toys against the floor, something began to sink into my stomach. If I had been a little older, if I had understood, maybe things would have been different. He slept less, ate less. During playtime in the yard, he would creep closer towards the hole. Every time he was admonished for getting too close, the more distant he became. All of his hobbies were forgotten. He only talked and thought about that hole. My family acted unbothered, but I could feel the tension in the air. When he started asking questions, I would often hear the five of them talking in hushed tones in the kitchen. What was the hole? Why can't he play in it? He would be oh so careful. He promised. Why won't they let him in the hole? Why? Since they wouldn't answer his questions, he came to me. We were playing in his room one morning, despite the fact that I was a little too old for toys. I wanted to cheer him up, though, honestly, I was unsettled by how much I missed him, and I had to remind myself that he was right here, wasn't he? Why won't they let me play near the hole? Mike mumbled, half-heartedly dragging his dragon action figure across the carpet. I opened my mouth to say, I don't know, but held my tongue. This could be my chance to find out what was happening with Mike. So instead, I asked, what made you so interested in the hole? I tried to keep my voice as casual as I could, and sailed the small plastic car across the air and let it crash on the floor in spectacular fashion, adding an explosion sound effect for good measure. Mike became fidgety, eyeing the slightly ajar door. He leaned in close, and I was hit with an odd scent coming from him. Sickly sweet and slightly stale. Can I tell you a secret? Caught by the intensity of Mike's gaze, I leaned in too, nodding along like a conspirator. You know, I don't like when people don't answer my questions. I'm not stupid, but they treat me like a baby. So I waited until Mom said goodnight, and then I took out my earplugs. His smile looked too wide for his face. It was slightly crooked too, like someone stuck a finger on the edge of his mouth and dragged it an inch too high. Was his smile always that little bit crooked? I swallowed slowly, fighting against the instinctual horror of him having broken a rule. Oh, Mike, did you hear something? Mike jutted his lower lip out, as he usually did when he was considering a careful answer. Yes and no. I didn't hear a voice really, but I heard something coming from the hole. It sounded... He rolled his head left to right, as if he was listening. Inviting, he answered firmly. The word slithered under my skin. Inviting. What did that even mean? What do you want to do in the hole? Mike suddenly shook his head violently. I don't want to talk about the hole anymore. If I talk about it, it makes me want to go and I can't. His face twisted, and there was bitterness in those words that worried me. Go. Go where? I made a mistake that day. Only when I hope, if any of this sounds familiar, you won't make. I left him alone. See, this process, if you can call it that, is not slow. It doesn't take weeks or months. It's not gradual, evolving to the point where you absolutely can't deny what's happening. It's swift, and if you don't know what to look for, it'll take you in a flash. So yeah, I left him alone. Stupid. So stupid. Closing the door behind me, I walked as quickly as I could without arousing suspicion from Mike. Aunt Carol was in the basement, bent over a box of old clothes. I didn't know why what Mike had said was important. I just knew it was more than I could understand. When she saw the look on my face, she froze, like she knew what I was going to say before I did. I stumbled over my words, wanting so badly to verbalize why it disturbed me, but I came up short. I had barely gotten the word inviting out of my mouth before she dashed up towards the door. That was the first time I had ever seen an adult show fear. As a kid, family is usually the epitome of safety. Nothing bad can happen when your family is around. After that morning, I never felt that bubble of safety again. I tried to keep up with Aunt Carol as she sprinted down the hallway. She was running so fast I thought she'd fly right by the door. But at the last moment, she reached out and grabbed the door frame, using the momentum to spring herself into Mike's room. The room was just as I had left it, the only difference being that Mike was no longer in it. Aunt Carol gave a cry of such panic that my body rocked with it. I knew by the way her body caved in on itself that she could see Mike. I knew by the gentle breeze on my cheek that he had gone out the window. I didn't even know he could reach the window. I wondered if there were scratch marks under the window, like he clawed his way up there. But my eyes wouldn't move from the carpet, from those toys. He always took such care of his toys. But here they lay, as if they were nothing. That wasn't Mike. Carol grabbed my hand and dragged me with her out the door. I don't know why. I think she just needed someone to hold on to. We didn't get to Mike in time. Just as we burst through the patio doors, I could see him standing at the edge of the hole. All I kept thinking was, it'll be fine. Worst case, he scrapes his knee falling in the hole. As soon as he jumps in, we can pull him right out and put all this nonsense to rest. It'll be over. There's nothing wrong with that hole. Nothing. His little blue and white sneaker dangled over the hole as he gazed into it. My aunt screamed his name, but he only turned briefly to give us a cheerful grin. And then he dropped over the ledge. I watched it all. I watched his feet disappear over the rim, then his knees, then his hips. 1 second he was there, and the next he was just gone. There was no thump of him hitting the floor, no request to help him out. For a moment, it was pure quiet. And then, Aunt Carol screamed. At 12, I had been to a funeral or two of old and distant relatives. The funerals were quiet and sad, with a sniffle here or there. That's what I thought death was. A quiet sleep, a somber farewell. I had never seen grief so fresh, and it changed everything I thought I knew about the world. It cracked it open in a horrible way. Cracked me open in a horrible way. Mike was gone, and he never came back. My family mourned him as if he was dead. But it was the not knowing that hurt the most. I haven't seen my aunt in years. I don't know what that hole is or why it's there, or what it does with the people it takes. I only know what I saw. This was to be my burden, but now it's yours. I can only pray that you will listen. Don't let your son near that hole. Don't leave him unsupervised in the garden, and if he ever seems to listen to something inviting, do not hesitate to run, because it will not hesitate to take him. I won't hope that you will forgive me. I only hope that your son is not curious. I'll first tell you what I do for a living, as it will bring some understanding to my situation. I run my own business, if you could call it that. I've thought of it more as a personal service. I break into the home or building of a client's choice, destroy or steal whatever they want, provide proof of the action, then I get paid. My clients usually take the form of a middle-class man angered at their boss, or a recently dumped individual who wants revenge on their ex. Essentially, I do the work that one has the anger and desire to do, but doesn't have the actual nerve to do it themselves. It paid well, and it gave me some interesting places to explore, so I've been quite content with the job. About a few weeks ago, I received a usual call for what I expected to be a usual job. The caller requested me to break into an abandoned home, not too far from my area. He requested me to retrieve a few recordings of sorts, VHS tapes, cassettes, DVDs. They didn't matter. All he really cared about was anything that looked interesting, as he described. Despite the fact that information is important to my work, he didn't tell me anything that would be useful for the search. He wouldn't even tell me anything about himself, which almost made me turn down the job, until he offered me an unusually large payment. When the caller had mentioned abandoned home, I had expected the location to be a shed away from the local population, and generally safe to break into during the day. To my frustrated surprise, the place was in the middle of the damn street, right along a string of other apartments and surrounding buildings, most of which were populated. People on the sidewalk strolled past it, not acknowledging its derelict state, sometimes being taken aback by its derelict state. I came back after dark, and it was just how I wanted it to be. No pedestrians anywhere, and there were no lights on in the surrounding structures. It appeared to be an easy target. The home stood 2 stories, with a small attic at the highest point. It didn't look like the most enjoyable place to live, even before it had aged. The best word I can think of describing its living quality would probably be confined. It appeared to have only a single window, which was on the attic level. The front door had far too many locks on it, all of which were now rusted away. It opened with a mere tap from my foot. I should probably state here that I don't have any nyctophobia or anything like that. I enjoy completely dark abandoned buildings, just as much as the next wandering man. By my first step into the house, I wanted the job done fast. What I'm saying is that I was not paying attention to specific details at the time of both the home and what may have been there. When I turned on my flashlight, the first room appeared entirely vacant of anything, as if it had been completely cleared after the departure of its residents. This was both good and bad in my situation. This meant that the room was free of obstacles, but also meant that I would need to search more of the home, which I wasn't excited to do. There were other homes around, but I would be fine if I at least kept the noise to a decent level. The place hardly had any windows after all. I had gone up the stairs to find a similar area, an empty room, with nothing that I was looking for. This meant further worse news. I would have to check the attic. Though I said I wasn't severely frightened by the dark, I would be lying if I said I didn't have a discomfort with tight spaces. The attic was accessed by a standard pull-down stairway on the ceiling of the second-story room. It took a couple of jerks to budge, but it came down without much resistance. A large cloud of dust covered my view for a few seconds, which made me realize how old the place really was. Each step of the stairway creaked tremendously, to where it became more irritating than unnerving. The last step brought me inside the attic, which showed the only window in the house. A bit of moonlight shined down into the small room, which helped ease my tension by a near insignificant amount. Scanning the room, I had finally caught eye of a few boxes in the corner. 3 aged cardboard boxes, all packed with a number of old VHS tapes. No DVDs, though the place was so old that I didn't expect to find any. I was still in a rush to get out of there, so I didn't take much time looking through them. I didn't even pick out a few. I just grabbed the heaviest box and dragged it to the ladder. I didn't even realize exactly how much was in the box until I had dropped it to the floor, in which it made a rather loud crash that seemed impossible for its size. Some of the tapes were probably broken in this process, but I didn't stop to check. I just wanted to be out of there. When I reached the bottom of the ladder, I didn't bother putting it back up. This is where I first saw something strange. When picking the box back up, I saw a small red light in the corner of the room, like a sort of dot. It wasn't moving, but I still stormed to the stairs. I grew paranoid, so I didn't care to investigate what it was. I arrived at the top of the stairs, and I realized something else. That the house had another level, which I assumed to be a basement. There was another stairway leading downwards that could only be seen if one was actually looking down the stairs at the second level. At the bottom of the stairway was another faint but noticeable red dot. I was carrying the heavy box of tapes, so I didn't have a hand to shine my flashlight on it. Then I tripped. There was no other way of saying it. I tripped and tumbled down the entire stairway, all the way back down to the first floor. I should have broken a leg or my back in the process, but the box of tapes actually managed to break my fall in some sort of miraculous way. The VHS tapes scattered all across the bottom of the stairs, and I didn't want to take the time to retrieve them all. I picked up the 3 tapes that were closest to me. My body hurt like hell, but I was more focused on the fact that I had just made noise similar to a damn police raid. I made it back to my car, and then my home without issue. I woke up the next morning with aches all over, but I hadn't gotten caught, which was all I cared about. I called the client numerous times, and just as I had almost predicted, he never answered. The number he gave me didn't even have an answering machine, as if it had been disconnected. I was quite sure that this client was going to be a no-show, which made me quite frustrated. Most of the time, I'm able to steal other items during a raid, so a client not giving payment was never a typical issue. However, there was hardly anything to look at, let alone steal in that abandoned house, so I was left empty-handed after all the frightful work I had gone through. All I was left with was the tapes, which I decided to look at, just in case the client actually called back asking what I obtained. I was surprised to find that I even still had a VHS player in my closet. Because the tapes had no forms or labels on them, I just played the first one in the stack of 3. The first tape I played was just static for a few minutes. I was about to stop it when it actually did cut to a picture. There was a date on the lower left corner of the screen, which was August 2nd, 2010. It was footage of a small room, which was vacant of any furniture and looked to be in degrading condition. The video appeared to be in a form of night vision, so the room must have been dark. It was lifeless footage until a door, close to the camera, opened. A young woman walked through, and the door shut behind her as soon as she walked in. She started yelling, "Michael! Michael, it's me! Where are you?" She turned around in circles, searching for someone. There was a frantic, worried look of expression on her face. I assumed that this Michael would have been her son, or another close person that she was looking for. She waved her arms around in the dark before taking her phone out as a source of light. She walked to the end of the room and took a left at what appeared to be a stairway. The footage went to static a few seconds later. Now, I had an idea of where the footage may have been taken, but I refused to believe it at the moment of watching the tape. I didn't want to watch another just for that reason, though, for my own safety, I had to know if my paranoia was correct. The next tape started similar to the last, static for a few minutes, then it cut to the footage. It was footage of another empty room, which appeared to be in the same decaying state as the last. This footage also had a date and time, but it was March 14th, 2013, more than a year's difference. Someone came in from the small hallway leading into the room. This time, it was an older man. He actually had a flashlight this time and looked to the roof. He pulled down a staircase that led to an attic. This was where I flipped out. Those red lights, those dots in the corners of the rooms, they were cameras, and they were rolling. The abandoned house was rigged with them, more than I probably even saw. I at first believed it must have been some sort of police setup, in which I immediately checked all of my windows to see if my home was surrounded. I thankfully found nothing. I went back to the tape, and the recording showed the man climbing up the ladder into the attic. He too looked as if he was looking for something, or someone, but he never actually spoke. He also never shined his flashlight around the room, so I doubt he even noticed the camera. A few seconds after he was in the attic, the footage ended, but I did notice something. Just moments before the footage ended, the camera moved, as if it was picked up at the last few seconds. I immediately went to the third and final tape, as I wanted to know what else may have been looking at me in that house. This tape was viewing the stairway. It appeared zoomed in, like it was down another level but still focusing on the first to second floor. At the top of the stairs was the same man from the previous tape. Since I had dropped the tapes down the stairs when I collected them, I must have been lucky to grab two continuing tapes. The man in the footage appeared injured this time. He was clutching his left arm, which revealed to have blood running from it when I looked closely enough. He stumbled with each step as he progressed down to the first floor. When he was just about at the bottom step, he fell, probably out of exhaustion. At the top of the stairway stood something. It looked to be a person, about 6 feet tall, but I'm not going to make any assumptions that it was human. It walked down to the man, then began to drag him by his uninjured arm. The man put up little struggle, which led to him being kicked in the head by the being. It moved the man down the second staircase, the one I believed to lead to a basement. The figure was close enough to the camera where I could see its face, or at least what was covering it. It wore a mask, which looked to be an aged rag, with holes cut for each eye and numerous tears everywhere else. The skin exposed by the tears was a dark, bloodied gray, which led me to being more content that its face was covered. The thing stared at the camera for a moment, with blurred yellow eyes that made myself even more uncomfortable. It then picked up the camera and turned it around to reveal a door at the bottom of the staircase. The being picked the man up, opened the door, and kicked the man inside of another room which appeared to be empty. The door was quickly shut once the man went in. and then the camera just viewed the door for the next few minutes. What was disturbing here, however, was the sounds. Behind the door, there were many rapid scratching noises, as if the walls were being scraped. The injured man inside the room began to scream, and so did other voices. The other screams sounded inhuman, more animal-like than screams of a person. The injured man's screams were quickly cut off after what sounded like the ripping of flesh and the snapping of ligaments. I thought at first that the man stopped screaming, but then I realized that all the sound had been cut off from the footage. The door to the room then opened, and inside the room were other creatures. They almost appeared human, but appeared very frail and gray, with no hairs on their heads or anywhere on their body. Their spines were painfully visible and protruded from their bodies in an unnatural and excessive manner. The ones near the end of the room began to climb up the walls and onto the ceiling. One of them began to turn around, but the footage ended and cut to static before its face could be revealed. Naturally, I was terrified by this. I had just been inside that place, and I had been recorded in the same way. I checked all my windows again and locked them. I stayed indoors for a few days, keeping constant watch of if I was, being watched. I had burned the tapes, and when I was sure that I hadn't left any sort of trail from my visit to that house, I had begun to go out again. I occasionally took another job, but none that involved abandoned homes or structures. Not much more than 2 weeks ago, I had received a package on my front door. I assumed this to be a payment from a recent client, as most would pay me by simply dropping off their part. I opened it to find 3 VHS tapes, which appeared to be in new condition. They were each marked with a number, going from 1 to 3. I played the tape marked with 1 first. It was footage of the same abandoned house as before, and it was a camera in the first empty room. A few minutes passed, and then somebody entered. It was a younger man who wore dark clothing as if he wanted to keep hidden. It took only a second to realize that this man was me, and that the tapes were of when I entered the home. I went straight to tape number 2. The second tape was a recording of the staircase, with the camera planted near the door to the basement. It showed me stumbling out of the hallway to the stairs, with the box of tapes in both hands. I took a few steps down, then I watched myself trip and fall. Except, I didn't actually trip. I was pushed. A figure at the top of the stairs, wearing the same rag on its head as in the previous tapes, had slightly shoved me. It wasn't enough force to where I could have felt him behind me, but enough to where I had lost my balance with the box in my hands. The footage showed me jump back up to my feet with 3 tapes in hand and running off screen, which was when I ran out of the house. The masked being only ran to the bottom of the staircase and watched me run. It then slowly walked down the second flight of stairs and looked into the cameras for a few seconds. And then the footage ended. I was in more fear than when I had watched the previous tapes, and my paranoia of being followed became more severe. It took every fiber of courage in my body to keep watching, and I played the final tape. This tape wasn't from inside the abandoned house. It was held by someone, and it was taken from outside at a different location. The camera holder walked on a road for a few minutes until focusing the camera on a single house. The house was my house, and whoever or whatever was filming let out a loud, sickening laugh. Then the tape ended. I've grown paranoid, and with good reason. I'm not huddled in the center of my room all day, but I don't go out in public much anymore. Anytime I do, I feel like I see a masked figure out of the corner of my eye. Perhaps it's just a fabrication of my mind, but I sense it right next to me in some places. There will be a few days where I hear a knock on my door, only to find a single tape on the doorstep. Each is very similar to the last. It's always footage of my own home, usually during the day, but other times at night. And with each tape, the camera is getting closer. It first happened to me around Windhelm Drive. When the sedan passed me, it flashed its high beams. Either a cop was up ahead, or even more likely, a deer. I hit the brakes, scanning the forest on either side, but nothing popped up. No cop hidden on the side of the road, ready to pounce on unsuspecting speeders. No herd of deer staring at me with glowing eyes in the darkness. When I'd gotten about a mile away, I figured it was safe. I pushed my foot on the accelerator and resumed my usual speed. Must have been a herd of deer that crossed already. I turned up the radio, a staticky, "Carry on my wayward son" coming through. Damn, the reception in this valley really sucks. But my phone's battery was low, and I wasn't about to use up all the juice playing "Every Rose Has Its Thorn" for the 100th time. I turned the dial, but the rest of the station seemed even more staticky. At least I'll be home soon. I was halfway through making a mental checklist of everything I had to get done tomorrow, when another pair of headlights blinked through the trees. When it got about 20 feet from me, it flashed its high beams too. More deer? But as I drove through the darkness, I didn't see anything. No cop cars either, unless they were really well hidden. As the seconds ticked by, there was nothing else. No construction zone, tree in the road, or any other hazard. My heart began to pound. What was he trying to warn me about? I glanced down at my phone, the screen black in the passenger seat. Is it already dead? Maybe they were warning me about something wrong with my car. Both headlights seemed to be working, but maybe there was smoke coming out of the tailpipe or something. I didn't like the idea of being stuck on the road at 11 p.m. I sucked in a deep breath. It's probably just a deer. There's lots of them around here. Remember? The green sign for Emerson Ave popped up in my headlights, and my heart slowed. Less than 10 minutes from home. I thought about the fluffy furry blanket I'd just gotten a week ago, curling up in it, eating some chocolate before bed, as Leela snuggled up next to me. The thought made my heart slow even further. My cat, my room, my blanket. Another pair of headlights swung around the bend. As it approached me, it slowed, and then it flashed its high beams at me. My blood went cold. For some reason, 2 flashes seemed to fit within the realm of coincidence, but 3? It's no deer or a cop. It's something about me. Something wrong with the car, or a horrible thought shot through my mind. That urban legend, where there's a girl driving home late, and a truck keeps following her and flashing its high beams. But the trucker is a nice guy, and he's flashing the headlights because there's a guy in the back seat with a knife, and he keeps rising to stab her. Oh God. I turned on the headlights and whipped around. The back seat was empty, at least, as far as I could tell. Swinging my gaze back to the road, I reached my hand around the back of my seat. My heart pounded in my chest as I slowly, swept my fingers through the darkness behind me. What if there's someone there? I imagined my fingers meeting rough cloth, warm skin, sticky hot breath, the cold still point of a knife. But they only met air. I breathed a sigh of relief, swished my hand through the air a few more times, high and low. There was a dead spot that I couldn't reach, but it would be far too small for an adult man to hide in. Unless he was some kind of gold medal contortionist. So maybe it's something wrong with the car then. Maybe they see smoke or a door's ajar or a light's out. I glanced at the side of the road. There was a margin of dirt between the edge of the road and the beginning of the forest. I could safely pull over and check what was wrong. Then again, this road was really lonely, especially so late. There were only a few houses on this road, and none that I could see right now. Just thick woods, bramble and twisted bark that would muffle any screams. I'll take my chances driving home. I gripped the steering wheel, only about 5 more miles. I again thought of my warm little house, and Leela, with her fluffy black fur and permanent smirk. A pickup truck swung around the bend. I held my breath. They're not flashing at me. Good, good. I'm almost home. But then, there it was. Flash. The after image of the searing white light danced in my vision. Cold sweat broke out on my neck. Damn it, I whispered. What the hell is going on? Their headlights disappeared behind me, and the darkness immediately pulled around me again, like fluid filling a void. Scraggly crooked branches clawed at my car, silhouetted by the full moon. The radio played straight static. I reached for my phone, and then I heard it. Tap, 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 coming from straight above me. Something was tapping on my moonroof. My entire body shook. The dark road in front of me became a blur. No, this can't be happening. How could someone even be? I jammed my foot on the accelerator. The speedometer shot to 30, 35, 40. Tap, tap, tap. Without looking up, I reached a shaking hand up to the moonroof. I pressed my hand against the glass. It felt warm, even though it was only 40 degrees outside. Damn it, what the hell is going on? I couldn't look up. It was just this visceral instinct, like the feeling you get when you know someone is watching you, and your brain is screaming, hide. I bit my lip, staring at the road, waiting for my street to come up. Tap, tap, tap. Don't look up. Don't look up. Don't you dare look up. Maple woods appeared before me. I swung onto the street, then pulled into the driveway. Without even thinking it through, I swung the door open and ran as fast as I possibly could. Surprisingly, I got inside safe and sound. I spent half the night watching old movies, Leela curled up on my lap. I checked the front and back doors and all the windows, about 1,000,000 times each. I didn't dare look outside at my car. I closed my eyes, even when checking the front door. I thought I was safe, but I wasn't. Because now, I hear it again. Tap, tap, tap. It's more frequent now, more frantic, coming from right above me, right above my bed, coming from inside my attic. The room was one of many experiments that allowed us to tamper with the fabric of space-time in an enclosed location. to toy with the delicate laws of our physical world and fine-tune them to our liking. The first 370 went off without a hitch. Some of our finer work included room 112, where one could experience astral separation. With it, the ability to view remote locations. In another, room 213, there were dream storms. Any subject asleep inside would be bombarded with pieces of other people's nightly cinema, nightmares and all. And our crowning achievement up to that point, room 301. Within its walls, time stood still. No matter how long a subject claims to have stayed inside, they always exited the room at the same time they entered. Then, there came that room, the one that put all others to shame, room 371. The first few tests were promising. Mixed results and readings led us to draw the conclusion that this room had somehow inherited traits from all the previous ones. For starters, time was malleable in there. To an extent, subjects reported being inside for weeks, when really, it had only been days. In addition, they all experienced different things, out-of-body events, hallucinations, psychic visions. The list goes on. It was shaping up to be our best work yet. But then, the unthinkable happened. It is a day I will never forget, try as I might. Elizabeth, you're pregnant, 7 months along. You know my work here is dangerous. We can't risk your safety. A sigh of disappointment came through the receiver. I know, Garrett, I know, but I haven't seen you in over a week now. Will you even be here when our son is born? This time, I let out a sigh. The work we're doing here, it could very well change the world. When our son is born, I will be there, and I want him to be proud of his father. We had reached an impasse, and so we sat for a moment in silence, phones to our ears, each hoping for a bit of understanding from the other. It was in this silence that I charted a course for middle ground. I'll tell you what, why don't you leave Jessica with the nanny and get a room at the local inn? I usually sleep here, but the hotel is just around the corner. I could meet you there after work. We'll make a night of it. After work? Is there ever an after work with you? I chuckled. Not particularly, but I promise I will be there. Let's say 9-ish? Alright, I'll do it. You're lucky I still love you to pieces after all these years. There was a hint of reluctance in her voice, but deep down, I knew she was ecstatic to be met halfway. As much as I was married to my work, I would have given anything for even a small chance to make her smile. Good, I'll see you tonight then. I gave her directions to the hotel and we disconnected. I then turned my attention back to room 371. A box of walls connected the rest of the lab with the control arms and cables. It had no shortage of mysteries, and I would be damned if I didn't solve them all. If I only knew at the time just what I was getting myself into. Hours passed, and soon the sun's glow through the windows of the lab was replaced with moonlight. I was no closer to uncovering the inner workings of the room, but it was a long process, something that could take months or even years to unravel. Any lull in my research would push back the reveal, and I wanted answers yesterday. Still, the work took its toll. My eyes grew heavy, and my mind drifted to a sleep state as my head fell onto the desk where I was stationed. As soon as I lost consciousness, I was transported to a strange and vivid dreamscape. To this day, I can't be sure if this nightmare was a product of my exhaustion or the effects of room 371, just yards away from where I slept. In the dream, I was with my wife at the hotel. She was propped up in bed, screaming with her legs spread apart. I was by her side, holding her hand and doing my best to calm her through the agony of childbirth. She kept looking to me for comfort after each push. "It's okay, Lizzie. I'm here. You're doing great." She squeezed my arm harder with every pained outcry. It was pale and bloodless by the final push. Then, finally, our son was born. But something was terribly wrong. The baby didn't cry. Instead, as I pulled him into my arms, he smiled. Not a beautiful smile, mind you, but a strange one. It curved at unnatural points and stretched too close to the ears. Unsettling would be putting it mildly. Then, there was the eyes. Normal at first, but they soon turned black. Empty abysses that grew darker with every blink. I had no choice but to put him down to escape his gaze. "Elizabeth, here, you hold him for now." I looked down at my wife. She was unconscious. Her chest was still. I held my hand to her neck. There was no pulse. "Elizabeth! Elizabeth! Wake up!" I placed our son on the bed and attempted to shake her. When that failed, I resorted to chest compressions. Nothing seemed to work. No. My sweet Elizabeth. She can't be dead. She just can't be. Tears streamed down my face as the panic set in. I raced for the door to call out for help, but the knob wouldn't budge. That's when I noticed a number affixed to the wood. 371. Room 371. But how? The door swung open, striking me on the head and landing me on the floor below. I looked up, my vision blurred, and saw the shadowy outline of a man enter the room. He stepped over my body, grabbed my son, and then walked back out, but not before offering me an ominous sentiment. "They're mine now, Garrett." I awoke mid-gasp, jumping up from my desk. Frazzled, I looked over at the clock. It was 11:15 p.m. Oh no, Elizabeth! I dialed the hotel and had the clerk patch me through to her room. I only hoped she wouldn't be too upset over me sleeping through our date. "Garrett Harold Covenwood, this is no way to get on my good side." Judging by her tone, she was as irate as she had ever been. Still, it was nice to hear her voice after that horrible dream. "I'm sorry, hon. Work got away from me and I dozed off at my desk. It won't happen again. I promise." There was a faint voice in the background. "Is that Daddy? Can I talk to him?" It was our daughter. "Did you bring Jessica with you? I thought I told you to leave her with the nanny. Doesn't she have school tomorrow?" Her tone was still firm and unwavering. "Your daughter hasn't seen you in over a week. I've allowed her 1 day of hooky to spend time with her father. Get here now and don't waste another minute." It was clear she meant business, and I wasn't about to test her fury any further. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. I just have to..." My eyes drifted to the room, and I recalled the strange dream my mind had concocted. "Say, Elizabeth, what room are you staying in?" "Room 371. My heart sank. "Are you absolutely sure of that?" "Yes, what does it matter?" This was bad. The hotel where my wife was staying only had 2 floors. I know this because I had stayed there myself on occasion. There couldn't have been more than 100 or so rooms, nowhere near enough to warrant a room number 371. "Elizabeth, listen to me. Take Jessica and get out of there now. There was intermittent static after I said this. Garrett. Breaking up. Can't hear. Elizabeth, get out of there now. There was more static, but I made out a single phrase through the noise, one that sent a shiver down my spine. Garrett, I think my water just broke. We were disconnected. I tried dialing the hotel again, but the line was dead. I didn't know what was going on, but with the unforeseen powers at play in room 371, I knew it couldn't be good. With my family in mind, I threw all caution into the wind and walked over to the room. Normally, there were safety protocols to be followed before entering, but I didn't care. My working theory was that it was acting as a portal, bridging itself to a room in the nearby hotel and taking its place. The hope was that I could get in and pull my family out. This has to work. It just has to. Upon entering the room, my theory was proven false. It was just as we had left it last. There was no one inside, much less my wife and daughter. My next course of action was to flee the lab and make haste towards the hotel. But the room had other plans. The door slammed itself shut as I approached. I reached for the knob, but it wouldn't turn. Just then, footsteps from behind. Hello, Garrett. With a spike of adrenaline, I turned to meet the source of the voice. What I saw was astonishing. It was me, a copy of myself, living and breathing before my very eyes. Every feature, every detail, identical. I would have never suspected the room could do something like this. Not in a million years. Well, how do I look? After the initial surprise wore off, I regained my focus. My wife and daughter, what's happening? Is it you? He chuckled. Of course it's me. Who else would it be? I didn't understand what he was getting at. And you are? I asked. Don't you recognize me, Garrett? You've been poking and prodding me since my birth, studying my every nook and cranny. But I've been observing you too. Now, I've learned you inside and out, taken your form even. I thought you would be flattered. As indirect as his answer was, I was able to put pieces together. You're the room. You're this room, room 371. He smiled. Now you're getting it. My mind was instinctively trying to run the numbers and make sense of how any of this was possible. But this was no time for work. What are you doing with my wife and daughter? His smile grew wider. To know that, first you need to know how, and then why. I didn't have time for his games. Whatever he was, I lunged at him with my arms outstretched, but to no avail. My entire body phased right through. Nice try, Garrett. This is just a projection I've planted in your mind. Please, take a seat. I never have anyone to talk to. This is the most fun I've had. Well, since ever, really. I stood back against the wall and stared him down, my eyes now welling up. Please, let them go. I'm begging you. He shook his head in disapproval. I can't do that, Garrett. It wouldn't be in my best interest. I didn't understand. What are you talking about? It's simple, really. You see, you didn't create me so as much as you found me. I'm a reserve of cosmic energy, one that you've tapped into and harnessed with your latest project here. He gestured at the room around us. You've awakened me and given me the gift of sentience. For that, I thank you. But now that I'm awake, I'm hungry. You humans need air, water, and food to sustain yourselves. I need something else. What? What do you need? I asked, growing impatient by the second. Souls. I need to feed on the souls of living things to stay alive. And by golly, human ones are worth all the trouble it takes to find them. Trouble? I asked. Oh yes, you think I'm contained in this prison, but I can travel. It's difficult, but through certain connections, I'm able to find my prey. Lifelines, the auras you humans share with one another. At first, I couldn't reach them, but then you went ahead and brought them to me, close enough to taste. He was referring to my family. Why don't you just take me? I'm right here. Take me instead and leave them alone. He let out a horrendous, malignant laugh that pierced me to my core. I would never, Garrett. Through your aura, I'm connected to them. I can project this room and my likeness anywhere they are. You are my beacon, and until I can find another, you're with me. If I was hindered by remorse, I might say that I'm sorry. In truth, I'm not in the slightest. This is about survival, and I have no intentions of dying. Not when being alive feels so good. Feeling hopeless, I reached down into my lab coat and pulled out my pocket watch. I always kept it with me. A Christmas gift from Jessica. I could remember the day clearly, a memory that never strayed too far from my heart. Open it, Daddy. It's from me. Her smile was intoxicating. Oh, really? And did Mommy help you pick it out? Nope. I picked this one out all by myself. I slowly pulled apart the gift wrap, savoring the moment. Eventually, I pulled out the watch and opened its face, revealing a remarkable design within. This is wonderful, sweetie. I love it. She looked to me with inquisitive eyes. What's the matter, sweetie? Do you understand what it's for? I laughed. Well, of course. It's to tell time. She shook her head. No, you're always at work and you forget to come back and see us. This is so you don't forget, so you always know what time to come home. A little bit of guilt washed over me as a tear rolled down my cheek. I know I work a lot, sweetie, but I'll always come home to you. I promise. She jumped into my arms and I held her tight. My sweet little girl. I looked down at the inscription on the watch. To Daddy, love Jessica. Time to come home. It was time. Time to end this. I threw the pocket watch against the wall, as hard as my arm would allow. It shattered into 1,000 pieces. I kneeled down and picked up the tiny shards of glass that landed at my feet. Garrett, what are you doing? With glass in my hand, I looked up at him. I will never let you have them. Consider your bridge to the outer world closed. Using the glass, I sliced my arms open, slits long and deep enough that I would inevitably bleed to death in minutes, effectively cutting off whatever connection he had to my family. At least then, they would have a fighting chance. No, you'll ruin everything. The last thing I remember before losing consciousness was the sound of the door swinging open. Then, everything faded away. I awoke at my desk, positioned exactly as I was before. After gathering my wits and recalling what happened, I jumped to my feet and turned to the room. My clone was just standing right outside the door. Settle down, Garrett. You're going to be fine. I looked down at my arms. There were no wounds. I have the acute ability to manipulate time. You're now as you were just before entering the room. What about my family? He sighed. That was a bold move back there, attempting to take your own life. I didn't expect that. Had I known you humans were prone to sacrifice, I wouldn't have revealed so much. Your family is fine. He could see the disbelief painted on my face. See for yourself. He pointed at the phone on my desk. I hesitantly picked it up and held it to my ear. Go on, dial already. I dialed the hotel number and asked the clerk to put me through to my wife. To my delight, she answered. Garrett Harold Covenwood, this is no way to get on my good side. It was so good to hear her voice. Is Jessica there with you? Yes, how did you know? Thank God that we're both okay. Could you put her on for me? The next voice I heard was my daughter's, as happy as ever. Hi, Daddy. Are you going to come see us now? My little girl, safe and sound. Yes, sweetie, I am. It's time for me to come home. Yay! She was so overjoyed. Elizabeth took the phone back. You better not be toying with her emotions, Garrett. I'm not. I'll be there shortly. By the way, what room are you in? Room 102. Why? I sighed a breath of relief. No reason. See you soon. I love you. I hung up the phone and looked back to my evil twin. So what now? I asked. Well, until I figure out a way around your heroics, you and your family are safe. It sounded a little too good to be true. But don't you need to feed? Why aren't you killing me right now? He walked over with a stern look and leaned in as close as he could get. Why would I waste my time with an appetizer when you're going to lead me to the main course? I'd much rather have the three of them than just you, especially the newborn. Fresh souls are so much better than used ones. My blood was boiling, but I remained silent for fear of repercussions. I will have them, Garrett. Mark my words. He slowly backed away, turned, and walked towards the room. He then looked at me one last time and grinned. I hope you don't mind me holding on to this look for a while. What can I say? I like it. With that, he vanished into thin air, never to be seen or heard from again. At least, that was the hope. Soon after the ordeal, I took Elizabeth and Jessica home, packed our things, and drove as far away from that room as possible. I vowed never to work in that lab again for as long as I lived, or anywhere that kept me from my family. From now on, they come first. If that entity ever does come around, I'll be waiting. I will never let him take them. I work as a correctional officer in a maximum security prison. Now saying that probably brings up all sorts of images and ideas, but just know that the job is very different than what you see on TV. There are no nightly escape attempts, no big throwdowns on the yard every afternoon, and if your inmates are drunk, it's because they've been smuggling things out of the kitchen for weeks. Night shift, which was C shift, isn't generally very exciting, but it does have its quirks. For example, all of the guards on C shift knew about the mysterious shower in Quad 2 of confinement. At first, it was just a curiosity to help pass the time, a mystery to be solved, or some bit of annoyance that inmates could complain about ceaselessly. No one could have known just how bad it would get in the end. I've been an officer in the confinement unit of this prison pretty much since I got certified. There's a real need for male officers in an all-male facility. Shocking, I know. And the confinement unit is no different. Typically, the crew is small, each one filling a desired need, and in the 2 years I've been here, I've seen and heard some things that you don't see on TV. I've heard hits planned out through the back grating in the windows. I've had all manner of things thrown at me through the flap which we push their food and clothes through. I've been called some pretty colorful names, and I've stumbled across my fair share of bodies, hanging and bleeding, which needed immediate medical attention. Shower 5, though, was definitely the weirdest thing I've ever seen. I couldn't begin to tell you why. I doubt anyone could. But sometimes when you put an inmate in shower 5, they would reappear in shower 3. For those unfamiliar with how a prison quad is set up, let me explain. Each quad holds 28 cells, 14 on the bottom floor and 14 on the top floor, accessible by a catwalk. There are 5 showers in each quad. Shower 1 and 5 are on either side of cell 1 and 14. Showers 2 and 4 on either side of 15 and 28. And shower 3 sits between cell 21 and 22. We shower 2 quads a night, which roughly takes about 3 to 4 hours, and makes up the biggest part of our night. Quad 2 shower night was Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Inmates are cuffed, removed from cells, weighed, given haircuts, and are placed in the shower so we can search their cells. They're given roughly 15 minutes to wash and dry off before we come back to cuff them and return them to their cells. While they're showering, they're locked in the shower cell about the size of, well, a household shower, while we go to the next quad over and do pretty much the same thing. Sometime, within that 15-minute window, the inmate will close their eyes to blink, or maybe to rinse their hair, and suddenly appear in shower 3. It would happen anywhere from 2 to 4 times a month at first. It was never anything you could count on, and we'd sometimes take bets on when it would happen. It never happened in reverse either. Shower 3 was broke, so we never used it. But when we did put an inmate in shower 3 for holding, he never went anywhere until we were ready for him to go somewhere. The shower was a mystery that provided a much-needed break from the tedious job. And for the first 4 months, we laughed at the looks on the faces of the confused inmates who'd appeared in shower 3 with a head full of shampoo or frantically searching for a towel that wasn't there. It was all fun and games until inmate Ferris disappeared. Inmate Ferris was one of the few who didn't request shower 5 every night. The others fought like cats to get that stall each shower night, and I'd come into my quad many nights to the sound of them bickering about who would get it tonight. Or trying to trade breakfast trays for someone's spot in line. One inmate in particular, Garvey, used to trade his breakfast tray for the spot in the line that would get him to shower 5 every shower night. He showered there 9 shower nights for every 10, and still never had it happen. One night, in particular, we had just packed him away and put the next man into shower 5, only to return to find shower 3 occupied, shower 5 empty, and Garvey pouting like an angry child. They all tried, but, in truth, less than half of them ever got to experience it. And none of them got to experience it like Ferris did. When it came time for Ferris to go, he said he wasn't going to shower 5. Normally, this wouldn't have been a problem. There were usually tons of others willing to take his place. But tonight, Ferris was my last shower. Garvey immediately started hooting about wanting to take his place, but I ignored him. On that night, all I was thinking about was the food waiting for me in the fridge, and the prospect of being done with another night of showers. There was also the matter of Ferris's smell. Ferris had been refusing his showers for the last 7 shower nights. The other shift didn't quite enforce these rules as we did, about bathing once a week, and the administration had begun to take notice of his odor. They had sent orders after their latest inspection that Ferris would shower tonight, on his own or with assistance. "Look, Ferris, you're going in that shower. It's the only one I have available and you're my last shower." "I ain't going in that shower," he said, evenly as he stared at me through the glass on the door. I waved Purvis off as he started walking towards us, not wanting to spook Ferris and create a situation where there didn't need to be one. "Look, Ferris, we can do this the easy way or the hard way. If you refuse this shower, I can get a bunch of angry guys down here and put you in the shower. Or you can be an adult and go and take your shower so we can be done here. So, what's it gonna be?" He argued for a bit more, but in the end, he put on his cuffs and went to shower 5 meekly. I will always regret making him go. He was praying when I closed the shower door. He was very religious, and a shower that made people vanish was something he neither trusted nor understood. I closed him in and took his cuffs off, and at first, I didn't think he would shower at all, but as I descended the stairs, I heard the water start and decided to make a trip to the officer's station to have a quick bite. 15 minutes later, I returned to find 3 occupied showers and 2 empty showers. Well, not exactly empty, I suppose. Ferris's towel was still hung off the door, and his soap dish was sitting on the ledge. But of inmate Ferris, there was no sign. Purvis looked around, not quite understanding what had happened, and wondered out loud if we filled all the showers before we left. I said we had, and Purvis and I spent the next hour searching every shower, every cell on the quad, and every cell and shower in the other 3 quads too. We checked the CCTV in the station, but there was no video of him leaving the shower. The video showed him showering 1 minute and then gone the next. The strange shower hadn't disappeared Ferris to a different shower this time. It had simply disappeared him. The next 3 days were a nightmare. Ferris's disappearance prompted an emergency search of all the dorms, a compound-wide lockdown, the dispatching of a canine team, and a county-wide manhunt that extended into neighboring counties before it was finally called off, after a fruitless 2 weeks. For 3 days we were questioned, had to make multiple written and verbal statements, and were grilled endlessly by the local and federal officers. The cameras clearly showed that we had been absent from the quad when Ferris had disappeared, so after 3 days, they had no choice but to let us return to work. We weren't sure what to make of the incident, but we chalked it all up to the strangeness with shower 5. And we went on about work as usual. We didn't use shower 5 anymore though. It seemed like the strange magic had turned sour. And after finally making maintenance come down and fix shower 3, we stopped using it entirely. We didn't see Ferris for another 3 months. I've said we a lot in this story, but I haven't talked about the men I served with in confinement. Purvis was our muscle, 6 feet tall and built like a barrel, and I'm pretty sure all of the inmates thought he communicated through grunts. and the occasional go to hell. If you weren't an inmate, though, he was one of the nicest guys you'd ever care to know. I've spent many afternoons on his back porch with a beer in my hand and the smell of steaks on the grill. As I chatted with the third member of our trio, McMahon, Sergeant McMahon, was a 10-year vet who'd spent most of his time doing paperwork or fielding questions from the brass. He let us handle most of the day-to-day drudgery, while he insulated us in a warm blanket of correctly managed reports and accurately maintained logs. McMahon wasn't very imposing, standing about 5'2" with thick glasses and a slim frame. But he was knowledgeable about the job and always had something to talk about. He was the last sergeant I ever served with in that confinement unit. 3 months passed, and Ferris's disappearance was starting to fade. After the inquiries and the inquest determined we had nothing to do with the disappearance, they put us back in confinement and told us to keep a closer watch in the future. We talked about it sometimes, speculating what could have happened to him, but ultimately, we lost interest after the paperwork ended and the hype died down. He was gone, and we still had a job to do, so the showers went on, and days turned into weeks. It was Sunday when he came back. Sundays were normally a pretty easy day in confinement. We didn't do showers on Sunday night, and the night was spent cleaning and passing out toiletries, and generally just finding something to watch online as we ran out the clock. We brought food in to share most Sundays, and this was no exception. I brought chicken, Purvis brought soda, and McMahon brought a pecan pie that his sister had made. By 9 o'clock, we had caught up on our paperwork, passed out our toiletries, and were full as ticks and ready to find a movie. I had my feet kicked up on the desk and was just getting ready to enjoy a nap when the sound of boots on doors started in Quad 2. Purvis looked up on the screen and sighed. I knew it was too good to be true. We headed out into the quad to see what all the kicking was about. As Purvis and I came through the door, we were buffeted by screams of, "Shower 3," and "It's Ferris," and "He's dying." We came up the stairs 2 at a time, and what I saw will haunt me until the day I die. I'd seen men get hurt in this line of work. I'd seen men get stabbed, and I'd watched a few men die. But I had never seen anything to top this level of cruelty. It was Ferris, all right. We'd arrived in time to see his last few breaths and listen to him wheeze as his lungs finished filling with blood. He lay on the floor of the dirty shower, his blood pooling as it tried to flow into the drain and shuttered out the last minutes of his life. He was naked, and we were saved from having to look at his mutilated genitalia because of the fetal position he'd taken. A nurse would later tell us that his genitals had been cut and sliced cruelly before he died, and his stomach and intestines were a mess of punctured tissue. We didn't know about this until later, but what we could see was horrific enough. His skin had been sliced by long claws, and his back looked as though something had tried to peel him a strip at a time. His arms, his legs, his neck, his face, and especially his back were in bloody tatters, and when he finally died, I considered it to be a true mercy. "Go get the Sarge," Purvis said, and as the man with the shortest time in, I was regulated to the bubble while McMahon went to the floor to access the situation. They took Ferris out under a sheet, and it was dripping red in its wake. This started a whole new bombardment of paperwork, CCTV footage combed over a frame at a time, and witness statements being filled out and dispositions being taken. Luckily, we had done our rounds on time. One of us was on camera not even 30 minutes before he'd appeared in the shower. and it was agreed upon that the incident had been of no negligence to ours. The narrative they constructed was as unsatisfying as it was unbelievable, but it kept our bacon out of the fire, so we didn't argue. Ferris had managed to worm his way into the grates of the shower and had made it into the ventilation system. The other inmates had likely been feeding him and telling him when to stop moving. This was before audio was normal in the dorms, so we couldn't check. And after 3 months, he had gotten bored and wandered into one of the big fans and gotten cut up. He drug himself back into the shower 3 this time, and called for help, and that's when we found him. No inmate admitted to having talked to Ferris since he disappeared, and no blood was ever found in the vents. But this was a much better narrative than a shower that kept sending inmates from one shower to another. Sometimes, the administration just wanted paperwork to look good. Making sense was secondary. After that, no inmate would go near Shower 5. It spread to the compound seemingly overnight, and any inmate that came into Quad 2 would refuse to go into Shower 5. We were more than happy to oblige the request. One more weird occurrence, and they'd pull us all off and separate us between the other dorms. We all liked being where we were, and were in no hurry to get sent somewhere else. For the next month, we kept a low profile and tried our best to keep the disturbances to a minimum. If we needed a reminder of the incident, all we had to do was look at the red stains on the floor of Shower 3. We managed to keep the weirdness to a minimum for about a month before it went completely off the rails. Purvis and I were conducting showers in Quad 3 and 4 when they brought us in our latest wild child. Everett was what we'd call a frequent flyer, and had we known he was coming in, we'd have put him in the cell they just released him in from 3 days ago. He had gotten into another fight, probably over gang politics, and now he was sitting in a sally port again and cussing up a storm. When they asked him where we wanted him, we didn't even think about Shower 5. We told him to just put him in a shower on the other side and we'd deal with him later. I don't know if he said something to them or not, but they later told us that they loaded him into Shower 5, leaving the cuffs on because he was being combative, and left. We finished showers late that night, and just about the time my butt hit the chair, I remembered Everett. I haven't heard a peep out of him. Did they load him into a cell? McMahon looked at his board and shook his head. Pretty sure they put him in the shower. A quick look through the glass told us that he wasn't in one of the ground floor showers. How could he be? We had used all the bottom showers to shower the other quads. When we asked them why they had put him in Shower 5, they answered that it had been funny to watch him piss his pants in fear of the mystery shower. It was less funny after the events of that night. We were preparing to go and put him away when a chorus of screams brought our attention to the quad. The inmates were screaming, terrified wails that only the doomed are capable of, and the whole quad was going nuts. We could all see the door to Shower 5, heaving and bucking, as something slammed into it with a machine-like rhythm. That wasn't like any kicking I'd ever heard, and added to the screaming, it put me on edge. Shower 5 had become something sinister, something not altogether understandable, and I did not want to see what new horror it had in store for us. I started to move, despite my apprehension, but McMahon stopped me. I've got this. Call the captain and get some help down here while we see what's going on. His action saved me. He and Purvis left the station in a hurry, piling up at the doors they hunted for keys, and came through the door, one behind the other as they mounted the steps. They were at the top of the stairs and heading towards the shower. when the door to shower 5 buckled outward. The door was reinforced metal, and whatever was on the other side had separated it from one of its hinges. The hinge hung lamely, concrete still clinging to it, as something dark and groping tried to come through the hole. The snapping mouth glistened in the overhead lights, as the creature scrambled and pushed to be free from its prison. I saw Purvis take a step back, bumping into McMahon as the two tried to process what was happening, and all thoughts of calling for help had fled from me as I watched the events unfold. The creature freed itself from the hole, black goo glistening on the torn door, and made its way up the wall with a hellish shriek and a metallic clittering I could hear through the glass. The whole quad had started screaming, and their hellish chorus was drowned out by the creature's screams of pain, as it left a glistening trail behind it on the concrete wall. The 2 officers, my friends, stood like statues as the thing swung its eyeless head from side to side. It seemed to be confused by all of the screaming, the sound bouncing off the concrete, and I thought my fellow officers might escape as Purvis took another tentative step backward. That's when McMahon started screaming. I've seen McMahon face down even the most hardest of inmates. Seen him hold the line during the last summer's riots, as we held the gate against a dozen screaming inmates. But this creature was too much for him. He screamed, and it cut across the hellish sound of the quad like a knife through butter. The creature then turned its eyeless face towards him, and the front of its bulbous mouth split open to reveal lines of serrated teeth, and a high-pitched sound like a piece of farm equipment scream. It leapt, coming stickily off the wall, but its path took it straight into Purvis, who was frozen in front of the screaming sergeant. It rode him to the ground, knocking McMahon off his feet, and the strange mouth ripped itself open to reveal rows of black glistening teeth. Its mouth dove, and it tore chunks of flesh out of the screaming man, as McMahon scooted backward in a state of sheer terror. He reached for his gas, the small can of chemical spray that is normally our best defense against aggressive inmates. But his hand seemed unsure on how to break the seal that held it in its holster, or even whether or not he wanted to. The creature, meanwhile, was tearing into Purvis. Purvis was not a small man. I had seen him lay hands on men who would have given me trouble and put them on their faces as easily as someone subdues a child. Purvis was straining against the thing as it tore blood strips out of his shirt, his undershirt, and his chest, but his biceps were losing purchase and he was starting to weaken. The creature raised its muzzle all at once and bit down on his face, engulfing the man's head in a single bite, and as Purvis kicked and thrashed under it, I saw McMahon get to his feet and make a run for it. The catwalk had 2 points of entrance, and McMahon seemed to think that if he could get to the other side, he could elude the creature and put the solid steel door between them. He almost did, too, until the creature looked up from the stripped skull it was now chewing on and heard him running down the stairs. It leapt, frog-like, and hit one of the overhead caged lights as it swung drunkenly before falling to the concrete with a shower of glass and twisted bars. As it fell, the creature leapt off it and caught McMahon in the back as he ran for the door. The door is framed by 2 large glass windows that stand about 25 feet high, so you can glance out at the quad and see what's happening at any given time. The creature slammed into McMahon and plastered him against one of these windows like a bug. His nose broke, his glasses shattered, and as he slid down, I could follow his progress with the trail of blood he left. The only thing visible was one hand, spasming while grasping at the impenetrable barrier between him and freedom, as the creature devoured him. I didn't know what to do. I just stood there with the phone in one hand, dial tone blaring at me, and the radio, on the other hand, putting out the same good-natured chatter it usually does at this time of night. It was so weird to think that somewhere else in the compound, there were people having normal nights. While my two best friends were being devoured before my eyes, there were actually people out there having comfortable nights, filled with nothing more pressing than a bellyache or an unruly inmate who wouldn't go to bed. It didn't even seem possible that our universes could be in the same plane of existence. I think that's when my mind snapped. Or maybe it was when I looked up from the radio and saw the creature looking at me, its eyeless face staring straight at me, that my mind simply unraveled. I let the phone slip out of my hand, let the radio clatter to the desk, and simply curled into a ball on the floor. I don't know how long I was there, but when I came back to myself, the captain was shaking me and all hell had truly broken loose. They had come in after I didn't answer the radio. They had used the emergency keys to come into the station and found me on the ground in a catatonic state. They had then looked out and seen the blood splattering the window and feared that a riot was underway. They had assembled their response team, a 7-man team with riot gear, and proceeded into the quad. As I looked out into the shadowy hellscape, I could see that several of the cells had been opened somehow, and there was a lot more blood on the floor than I remembered. The remains of bloody armor and broken shotguns lay everywhere, and the lights in the quad seemed to be in a constant state of flicker. The team had gone in and had been attacked by what they thought was a mountain lion or some kind of big cat. They had been ripped into shreds in a matter of minutes, and only the team leader had managed to escape. After throwing a flash grenade in the thing's face, it had battered the door a little while trying to get at him, but had eventually gone back to eating the remains of the other 6 members. The team leader said it looked like some of the inmates had also been killed, though he couldn't figure out how this thing was getting into the cells. They looked to me for answers, but I didn't have any. The team leader joined me in a fetal ball in the corner while the captain made calls for backup. I sat in that station for the next 2 days, nodding off while sleep finally took me, and watched as the state police and animal control tried to figure out just how this thing got out of the quad. After the 3rd police officer was ripped to shreds, we got a visit from someone higher up. He told us that the quad was to be quarantined until further notice, the reflective lenses on his sunglasses making him look just as inhuman as the creature, and that no one was to go in or out until this thing was dead. The captain asked him what we should do about the men trapped inside, men who hadn't eaten in 2 days, and he simply shrugged and said if they were in there, they were as good as dead already. That thing isn't going to let anyone out once they're in, and a rescue attempt isn't going to do anything but lose you more men. Don't worry though, we'll make it so anyone who ever gone through that door looks like they never existed. He was true to his word. McMahon and Purvis were unmarried bachelors, and so they just disappeared one day after work. Of the 27 inmates that had been in that quad, I don't know. Their files were gone when I came back. Their DC numbers and CDC records were expunged, and all the cells were open and empty. The doors to Quad 2 were sealed shut, the door welded closed and caution tape draped across it. I was offered McMahon's position as confinement sergeant, and I took it. I took it not because I wanted it, because I felt it was my sacred trust to stand guard against that thing every night. I've never seen it during the day. It doesn't seem to like the light. You can catch glimpses of it in the darkness as it stalks the rats and roaches that live in the quad. The new officers they put back there always ask me what happened to Quad 2, but I never tell them the whole story. If they knew, they might try to get its attention and add more blood to my hands. I've seen officers come and go in the 10 years since that day, but I haven't told anyone about the incident. My captain is a major now at another facility. Everyone from my old shift has either quit or moved on, and I alone keep my vigil here every night. Sometimes I see him in the semi-darkness, looking at me and thinking. After 10 years, I imagine he's hungry for something more than rats. Maybe in another 10 years, he'll question how thick that glass is between him and real meat. And when he does, I'll be here. There's something terribly wrong with my son. He is only 4 months old, but I can still tell that he isn't acting like himself. He used to laugh whenever I made funny faces, but now he just stares at me. He stares at me with a blank yet strange expression. He used to cry at night, just like a normal infant. But now, he just lies there, looking at the ceiling from the comfort of his crib. It's downright weird. I'm not even sure if he's sleeping anymore. Every time I get up in the middle of the night to check on him, he's just lying there with that same facial expression, staring at nothing. He stares at nothing, that is, until I enter the room. Then he turns his attention to me. I don't like it. I truly don't. I decided to take the little guy to the doctor's office shortly after this string of occurrences began. As unsettling as the ordeal seemed, I was more concerned than anything else. This was my only child after all, and being a single parent tends to leave little room for me to do much else but worry. Sometimes, I wish I had someone to share the burden with. For now, it's just me and him. Upon arriving at the doctor's office, I noticed that there were others in the waiting room. A mother, her son, and their service dog. I'm fairly certain the mother was deaf. The boy looked to be about 3 years of age. He looked over at us and smiled, but his amused demeanor was abruptly replaced with what appeared to be a look of terror. He scrambled over to his mom's leg and hid behind it. This is when the dog looked over at us and began barking wildly. It was the weirdest thing. The mother managed to calm both her son and the dog down, and the three of them took their turn with Dr. Harrison. They eventually left, leaving only my son and me. We continued to wait while Dr. Harrison prepared for our appointment. The time that then passed must have amounted to only mere minutes, but it felt a hell of a lot longer. I could see my son staring at me out of the corner of my field of vision. I could feel his eyes piercing through mine, even though I refused to look back at him. I can't explain it, but an odd sense of anxiety began growing within me. Luckily, Dr. Harrison came out and saved me from my private anguish. It sounds awful, but I couldn't bear to be alone with my son any longer. I spoke with Dr. Harrison and explained everything that had been going on, being careful not to tell him about what had just happened in the waiting room. I didn't want him thinking I was crazy. He performed the usual tests on my son and told me that he was a perfectly normal and healthy baby. He even told me that I was lucky that he was so calm at this age. Lucky? Really? I couldn't wrap my head around this. No, I wasn't. And no, my son was not normal. Normal babies don't act this way. They just don't. I could have ignored the situation and chalked it up to an odd phase that he was going through, one that would hopefully pass in the coming months. But not only did it not pass, it became much, much worse. I tucked my son into his crib just a few nights ago and tried my best to ignore that blank glance that he threw my way. I turned off the light and went to bed. This was my normal routine. At roughly 3 in the morning, I woke up. I don't know why I woke up at such an odd time. I usually sleep through the night, like a baby, for lack of a less ironic phrase. I am, however, glad that I woke up when I did, due to what I found upon waking. Well, glad in a sense. There, on all fours, crawling about on my bed, was none other than my son. How was that even possible? I quickly looked over at the crib. It was just how I left it. There was no way he could have crawled out of there at his age. He surely would have hit the floor with a loud thud and injured himself. So how exactly did he get from his crib to my bed? How? I put my son back in his crib and tried to go back to sleep. I found this task to be nearly impossible, as I couldn't get the image of my son out of my head. When he was crawling on my bed, he was crawling towards me. Not only this, but he still had that blank expression on his face, staring at me as he crawled, his eyes never wavering. He didn't blink, not even once. Why was he crawling in my direction? What would he do when he finally reached me? The questions that frightened my brain were too much for me to simply go back to sleep. I stayed up for the rest of the night and spent most of it staring at my son's crib. Eventually, my weariness did catch up with me. Shortly after the sun came up over the horizon, I passed out. It must have been a good hour before I woke up again. After rubbing my eyes a few times and looking over at the crib, I realized something. My son was not in it. I jumped up quickly and investigated. I tossed his blankets around, only to find that it really was empty. He was gone. I looked over at my bed, but he was not there either. I turned my apartment upside down looking for him. I checked every room, every little nook and cranny I could possibly find. While doing this, there was quite a large knot in the pit of my stomach. I couldn't tell if I was worried for my son's safety, or if I was just plain scared. Perhaps it was a bit of both. I finished scouring my apartment and went back to my room to catch my breath. What I saw nearly took it away again. There, lying in his crib, was my son, as calm as could be. I walked over to the crib and just stared at him. He, of course, stared back with that unnerving expression of his. I realized then that I was truly frightened of an infant. I looked at him for a few more moments before speaking. "What are you?" His eyes widened upon hearing me speak. I cannot be certain, but I think that maybe, for just a split second, my son might have grinned at me. It's been almost a week since my son crawled up onto my bed. Since then, I've set up a video camera in the room just to see what I might catch. The camera makes me feel safer than I did before. I know it sounds ridiculous, but I think it is the camera that's keeping him from doing anything else. Either way, at least I managed to get a little bit of sleep at night now that it's there. The camera is of very decent quality. It has night vision, HD audio capture, everything I need to watch over the actions of my son at night. If he even so much as moves a limb, I will see and hear it. I finally had a way to combat my woes. But setting up this expensive piece of equipment did make me feel foolish. It's one thing to monitor your child for their own safety, but I was in fact spying on my son to see if he was up to something. It wasn't for his safety, it was for mine. It sounds crazy, I know, but what happened next did confirm my suspicions, if only a small extent. Until last night, the footage was completely normal. My son slept through the night as I tossed and turned. I think that perhaps he was pretending to sleep for the camera's sake. The second night of recording, however, was a bit strange. The first few hours were normal, much like the night before, but that is when my son did something surprising. Using his tiny, undeveloped arms and legs, he stood up in his crib, using the bars to lean on. He adjusted himself to face the camera and stared at it. He stared for a solid 12.5 minutes with that horribly unsettling, blank expression of his before lying back down. The part that really gets me is about halfway through the clip, where he actually lets go of the bars and is standing up on his own for a few minutes. This, to me, was utterly unexplainable. I was shocked. A plethora of theories bombarded my mind at an alarming rate, from the mundane to the sinister. Maybe he was just advanced for his age, having the ability to not only stand up straight, but also escape the confines of his crib and crawl onto my bed like he'd done almost a week previously. I quickly discarded this thought, deeming it nearly impossible. Perhaps he isn't my son at all. Maybe he is something else entirely. Not even a he, but an it. I discarded this theory as well, not wanting to give it any notions of the supernatural. It wasn't logical. I knew I would have to speak with Dr. Harrison again to potentially put my weary mind at ease. I had already made an appointment to see Dr. Harrison again later in the week, but after seeing this footage, I had him squeeze me in early. I made my way to his office once again, son and all, and patiently sat in the waiting room. I paid no attention to my son's blank stare, like before, but it still made me feel uneasy. As we waited, his stare became increasingly more difficult to ignore. For whatever reason, I felt compelled to look back at him, even though I knew it would make me anxious to do so. Even so, I turned my head downwards and stared at him. His eyes. There was something wrong with his eyes. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but there was something terribly off about them. They were the same eyes, but they still seemed different. I don't quite know how to explain it. Luckily, Dr. Harrison came out of hiding, putting an end to our nerve-wracking staring match. What a relief. I don't know why, but I feel like I would have just kept staring at my son, seemingly to no end, rather than dwelling on my inner fearful inclinations. I focused on the task at hand. Skipping the seemingly normal parts of the video, I showed Dr. Harrison the odd occurrence from the second night. He watched in awe as my 4-month-old stood up on his own and faced the camera. Becoming impatient, I asked for his thoughts on it. You know what he had to say? He actually congratulated me on having such a well-developed child. He said that my son was advanced for his age, and that he was glad to have helped him along in the process, as if he had something to do with it. Telling him about the night he crawled onto my bed heeded no results either. It only added to his already oversaturated ego. I was absolutely flabbergasted by his reaction. In any case, I did manage to get the receptionist to refer me to a specialist, one in infant behavior, when I was on my way out. I desperately needed someone to talk to, anyone to talk to that wasn't completely oblivious to the matter. I went home both angry at Dr. Harrison and exhausted from the ordeal. Mentally, as well as physically, I put my son in his crib, being careful not to look at his eyes again, as much as I felt the need to. I then went out to the living room and sat down on the couch in an attempt to unwind. I shut my eyes for but a moment and quickly fell asleep. I dreamt, in my dream, I was sitting on the couch, just like I was before falling asleep. I tried getting up, but my legs and arms felt very heavy and sluggish. I gave in to the situation and just sat there. I took a look around and noticed that the room looked a little bit different. The frames I had up on the wall containing pictures of my wife and son were now empty. It was then that I began to feel dizzy, as a strange knot grew in my stomach. I felt a need to look over to my left, towards the bedroom. There, standing up on his own, was my son. He was at the doorway to the bedroom, just staring at me. Before I could even privately react, he began walking. In an awkward slush of movement, my son walked towards me. His stride was grotesque and unnatural, causing the knot in my stomach to grow larger. He continued to walk until finally reaching a spot just a few inches from where I was sitting. He reached his hand out towards me as I watched in horror. What was he going to do? Why was this happening? Why? I woke up before my son's hand could reach me. I jumped up in fear, still half asleep, and ran into the bedroom. I rushed over to the crib, and a wave of relief overcame me. He was still in there, staring blankly up at me, like he always did. Thank goodness. I walked back over to the couch and sat down to collect my thoughts. It seemed that even in my sleep I'm not safe. This mess that I found myself in is causing me not only a great deal of stress, but also to have nightmares. I need it to end. I will be giving the specialist a call shortly to set up an appointment. In the meantime, it's back to square one, trying to get some shut-eye while recording the actions of my son, in the hopes of finding some answers. It seems that this is what our little family has come to. We now lie at the cross-section of strange and completely mad. I, for one, just want everything to be over and done with, so I can finally get a good night's rest. I've called Miss DeWitt, the specialist, and we've set up an appointment for next week. I would feel enthused about this had the situation not escalated last night. It seems my son's behavior has taken another turn for the worst. Unfortunately, I seem to be the one and only target for his nightly antics. Many times during this ordeal, including now, I have asked but a simple question that I can never seem to get a clear answer to. Why me? While we're on the subject of questions, another one has haunted me as of late. Why does my son act in the manner that he does? I really need to know why. And then, there's the dreams. What is their significance? I could understand if it were the only one, but that is not the case. It seems that every time I close my eyes, a new film reel begins rolling, with every new movie starring my son as the antagonist. Every narrative is structured differently, but the plot remains the same. I am always frozen, and unable to move, whilst my son finds new and unique ways to terrify me, before finally making his way to wherever I am. I then wake up in a cold sweat, as frightened as I was while asleep. I suppose it doesn't matter how each narrative is woven. I always end up caught in my son's malevolent web. Even so, these nightmares could just be the byproduct of an overactive, anxiety-ridden imagination. They are probably meaningless. At least that is what I tell myself to feel better about them. But that doesn't necessarily mean they aren't meaningless. Besides, the fear I feel while dreaming is nothing compared to what I feel while awake. Like the feeling I had last night, for instance. Instead of explaining to you the events as they unfold, I will start off by portraying them through the footage, if only for the sake of transparency. You will understand what I mean as we begin. Up to a specific point, the footage was almost identical to the video I captured the other night. My son stood up on his own and faced the camera, followed by what I am now convinced might be a perturbed and menacing gaze. This is where things get a little strange, or should I say, stranger. After a few moments of my son staring, the camera seems to fall off the shelf that I had placed it on, landing lens first onto the floor. This is when I woke up. Before continuing, I would like to share some of my thoughts on what might have happened. It is true that the camera may have simply fallen off the shelf, but I swear that I placed it in a position that left it secure. It also may be important to note that nothing else that was on the shelf had fallen off, so whatever did cause the camera's untimely descent didn't disturb anything else. I personally believe that my son somehow caused the camera to fall when he stared at it. I am aware how that sounds, but it's not as far-fetched when considering everything else that has been going on. I'm not really sure one way or the other. For now, we'll get back to the incident in question. From this point forward, I will explain the events from my perspective, if only for a clearer picture than the fallen camera can provide. I woke up to a loud thud and jumped up immediately. I was worried that it might have been my son falling out of his crib. Upon further inspection, I noticed that he, once again, had vanished. After tossing his blankets around in his crib looking for him, I heard the once familiar sound of my son crying. I abruptly stopped my search and stood still, stunned. My son had not displayed a single emotion since his odd behavior started, let alone shed a tear. I was most certainly taken aback by this. I took a moment to process everything before regaining my composure. The sound of my son crying was coming from the direction of the living room. I ran out there as fast as I could, but the crying stopped almost as suddenly as it had begun. I turned the light on, but my son was nowhere to be found. The crying started up again a few moments later. Only then, it was coming from the kitchen around the corner. I ran out there only to have the crying stop once more, and to find that my son was not there either. What the hell was going on? I sat down on the kitchen floor and attempted to calm myself down. I hadn't noticed before, but I was shaking from the adrenaline. Why was this happening? How was any of this possible? I asked myself these questions, but knew not the answers, nor how to find them. I couldn't even find my son for that matter. It seemed my nightmares were bleeding into my waking life, and there wasn't a single thing that I could do to stop it. I continued to sit on the floor, unable to keep from shaking. This is where the sound of crying started up again. This time, it was coming from the back in the bedroom, where this impromptu late-night adventure began. As I ran from the kitchen to the bedroom, my heart pounded in my chest. I was scared. I didn't know what I would find upon entering my bedroom, but whatever it could have been simply scared the hell out of me. Even still, I had to keep running. I had to see if my son was safe, even if it wasn't him. And so, that's exactly what I did. Upon entering the room, the sound of crying ceased. I ran over to the crib and saw my son. Lying there, he was once again staring at me, with that eerie expression of his. I was relieved that he was safe, but still frightened by what had happened. My breathing became irregular, and a tightness formed in my chest. It was the onset of a panic attack, I think. I needed to take yet another moment just to pull myself together. I walked over to my bed and sat down, hoping that I wouldn't fall apart right then and there. I had to stay focused and keep this family functional. Somehow, the stress and lack of sleep were taking a very large toll on me. Despite this, I tried my best to explain the night's events to myself in a logical fashion. It became quickly apparent that I couldn't, not while replaying these events in my head. However, I did realize something. I stood up and walked back over to the crib where my son was lying. I hesitantly reached out a hand towards him. I carefully brushed my fingers across his cheeks and noticed that they were not wet. There had been no tears. My appointment with Miss DeWitt was earlier today. I must say that I do feel a bit strange. I don't really think I can trust anyone anymore. My son and I are going to have to deal with this issue on our own. It is apparent to me that nobody can help us. Not Dr. Harrison, not Miss DeWitt, not a single human being on this earth. As alone as this revelation makes me feel, I somehow feel empowered at the same time. It has put things into perspective and is allowing me to take my life into my own hands, no matter how messy my situation is. Deep down, I know that I can get through this. At least, I hope I can. Allow me to explain what happened. After another restless night with my son, I sluggishly began getting ready for my appointment with Miss DeWitt. For whatever reason, I was very nervous. This was odd, as I had no reason to feel that way. I should have been excited if anything. After all, this quite possibly could have been the first step in helping my son with whatever ailed him. Even still, I could not shake the feeling. Skipping breakfast due to my loss of appetite from my nerves, I quickly left with my son. The drive took roughly 45 minutes, as Miss DeWitt's office was in the next town over. I wished that I could say that the drive went smoothly, but it did not. About 15 minutes in, I decided to check on my son with the aid of my rearview mirror. He had been silent the whole time, but I put off checking on him until that moment, due to my own fear of his unnatural gaze. I knew I wouldn't like what I saw when looking in my mirror, but I did not know to what extent. Upon looking at my mirror, I noticed that my son was gone. His booster seat was still there, but it was empty. My heart sank as I quickly turned into the breakdown lane and slammed on my brakes. I stumbled out of the car in haste and opened the back door. I scoured the entire vehicle looking for him. I flipped over his booster seat, tore everything out of the car that wasn't tied down, and nearly ripped up the upholstery looking for him. Despite my best efforts, my son was nowhere to be found. I wondered for a moment if I had left my son at home. I tried to remember everything I had done that morning, but it was all a blur. I blamed this on my lack of sleep. Just before convincing myself that I needed to drive back home and see if he was there, I realized that I hadn't looked everywhere just yet. I know it sounds a bit crazy, but I felt the need to check the trunk. It is true that I didn't look there, but it was of course with good reason. How in the world could a baby get from his booster seat to the trunk in a moving car? But then again, how could he do any of the things he had been doing recently? Maybe, just maybe, my son was in there. In a confused stupor, I reluctantly unlocked and opened the trunk. Sure enough, my son was in there. He was lying on his back in the same way that he lies in his crib, and was, of course, staring up at me. I would have been shocked that he was in there, but I was more so fed up. My son's hijinks were mentally exhausting. They continued to take their toll on me, even in the middle of the highway. I just wanted it all to stop. I put my son back in his booster seat and got back on the road, pretending that nothing had happened. This was not before checking him for any injuries or bruising. There were none. This didn't surprise me either. Nothing did. I chose to focus on the road and my journey ahead, as opposed to the peculiarities that seemed to control my day-to-day life. It was all I could do to keep myself from going completely insane. I arrived at Miss DeWitt's office a little late due to the incident on the highway. Because of this, I quickly grabbed my son. Luckily, he was still there, and rushed into the building, hoping that she would still take us. I hurried up to her office door and opened it, revealing two people behind it. The two people were none other than Dr. Harrison, and presumably Miss DeWitt. They had apparently been discussing something before I barged in. What the hell? Confused, I nearly shouted at them, demanding to know what was going on. Dr. Harrison came over to me, ignoring my son altogether, and placed a hand on my shoulder. He told me that Miss DeWitt was not a specialist in infant behavior. She was a specialist in adult behavior. In other words, he said, she was a psychiatrist. I was dumbfounded. Was this some sort of intervention? Why the secrecy? What exactly was their motive here? Again, I ask, why me? I tried to turn around and leave, but Dr. Harrison pleaded with me. He seemed genuinely concerned about my well-being. As much as I disliked the idea of talking to a therapist, this was the first time Dr. Harrison had shown any real concern during this ordeal. I decided that it would be in my best interest to humor him, if only as a courtesy. I had thought about seeing a therapist anyways, so what did I really have to lose? Dr. Harrison said he would take care of my son during the session, so I could be alone with Miss DeWitt. He said there could be no distractions or disruptions. I knew I could trust him with my son, so I handed him over. Dr. Harrison awkwardly held him, almost as if he had never held an infant before. This was weird, but I brushed it off. Before long, I was sitting in a chair across from the one and only Miss DeWitt. It was time to open up, it seemed. Miss DeWitt was young and attractive. She had long black hair tied up in a bun, glasses, a white button-up shirt, and a black skirt that came down to her knees. Her demeanor was alluring, and her voice possessed a certain charm about it. It was comforting as well as pleasing. There was just the right amount of appeal there to still consider her appearance to be one of elegance and class. I could see right through this ploy. The manner in which she conducted herself was created to make it easier for me to spill my guts, so to speak. It was a ruse to get me to divulge my inner workings, my secrets, my darkest thoughts. I decided that I would not succumb to her prying ways. We began by talking about normal things. I talked about my place of employment, my home, and the people I associated with. Without noticing it, her questions became more and more intrusive. She asked about my childhood, my parents, and important events in my life. I didn't notice her verbal intrusions at first, because she shared with me her past as well. With every story or answer I gave her, she offered one to me in return. We laughed together about some of these stories. It was nice. To be honest, it felt like I was on a first date. She was very easy to talk to, and I had no issue with giving her the information that she desired. But that is when she went too far. After discussing some arbitrary events from my college days, Miss DeWitt seemingly jumped the gun and asked me about my wife. Like glass abruptly shattering, the immersion was broken. Still similar to some first dates I've had, we began to argue, and I mean really argue. It went on for what must have been an hour. We even began yelling at each other. I don't know why, but I felt like I was fighting with a good friend. At times, it even felt like I was fighting with my wife. I can say now that Miss DeWitt is very good at her job and is quite the actor. Like many fights I've had with friends, this one eventually came to an end in a calm and collected manner. We actually made up and apologized to each other. It even felt like we were closer because of it. I guess there was just something about this woman that made it difficult to stay mad at her. In any case, I decided to discuss with her what had happened with my wife. She didn't even have to ask again. I just started talking. Bewildered and surprised, she sat down on her desk and intently listened. My wife and I had a picture-perfect relationship. I met her in college and we instantly became close friends. We knew everything about each other and depended on one another for support during tough times. We could always count on the other one being there. It was a great feeling to have. Just knowing this. We knew that we liked each other, but never once did we talk about it. On the day of our college graduation, I simply pulled out a ring and asked her to marry me. She shouted with the word yes at me before attacking me with a tight embrace. It was a very spur-of-the-moment thing for me to do. I didn't plan it either. The idea came to my mind that very day. Even still, I have never been more sure of anything in my entire life. After settling down and putting our college degrees to use, my wife became pregnant with our son. It wasn't planned, but the two of us could not have been happier about it. I, for one, could think of no other person I wanted to have a child with. Things were looking up for us. Until about 9 months later, that is. I won't go into too much detail, but my wife died while giving birth to our son. The list of complications that led to her demise was a very long one. It was so long, in fact, that it made her death seem inevitable. I have since come to terms with her passing, putting all of my love and affection into our son, not only for my sake, but for hers. That is why I am so desperate in my hunt for answers. He's all I have left of her. He's all I have left of us." Miss DeWitt didn't interrupt me, not even once. She was turning out to be not only a great listener, but also a great friend. I actually felt good after opening up to her. I'd never told anyone about my wife before, or at least not at that length. It was cathartic, in a way. But of course, Miss DeWitt and I were not friends. We had just met. This was a business call, a favor to Dr. Harrison. Her following questions reflected this. After hearing my long and drawn-out tale, Miss DeWitt asked me about my son and what happened to him. I had no idea what she was talking about. She asked confusing questions about what happened to him right after he was born. I simply told her that I took him home. She continued her assault of questions, but my answer was the same each time. What did this have to do with anything anyways? Seeing as she could not get through to me, Miss DeWitt took off her glasses and stopped asking questions. Instead, she decided to tell me some things. The first thing she told me caused a sharp chill to resonate throughout my entire body. She told me that my son was dead. Before continuing, she gave me a moment to react. I most certainly did. I yelled at her like I did before, but she did not yell back. She was letting me alleviate my own anger, it seemed. I attempted to storm off, but she insisted that I sit down and listen to what she had to say. Whatever pseudo-friendship we may have had ended the moment she told me my son was no longer alive. But she still had comforting charm about her. I decided to listen to her, but that didn't mean I had to believe her. I sat back down in my chair and remained silent. I looked at Miss DeWitt angrily while she spoke nothing but lies. She told me that due to the same complications that killed my wife, my son too passed away shortly after being born. It was her expert opinion that, unable to cope with the loss of my wife and my son, I had a nervous breakdown. The breakdown was so severe that my brain needed a way to repair itself. That is where my son comes in. Apparently, it was easier for me to pretend, as well as hallucinate that my son was still alive, rather than come to terms with both his and her deaths. A few unexpected tears rolled down my cheeks when she told me this. I'm not exactly sure why. Miss DeWitt continued by telling me that Dr. Harrison was very concerned over all this. He tried his best to play along, but he couldn't stand to see me like this anymore. It seems that every time I went to his office with my son, he simply pretended he was there. He also gave fake reactions when looking at a blank footage of an empty crib. He did this for me, as a friend, knowing that I had lost my family. I couldn't take any more of what she was saying. I attempted to get up once more and leave, but she begged me to stay. She told me to think of the little things that have happened to me. She said my brain was trying to desperately tell me that my son wasn't there. The reason I noticed my son's eyes looking off is because the one and only time I saw his eyes at the hospital, after he had passed, he never laughs or cries because only living babies can do these things. The crying I heard that one night was only the memory of him crying when he was born. The only time he ever shed a tear. The pictures vanishing in my dream were showing me that both my wife and son were truly gone. Last but not least was the terrifying nature of it all. According to Miss DeWitt, my son and his antics did not scare me. What truly frightened me was coming to terms with his death. I let her finish before getting up and angrily walking by her to the door. She could tell that I didn't believe a word of what she had told me. As such, she tried one last time to reach out to me. She reminded me of how impossible everything was that occurred with my son. She begged me to let her help. I turned around before opening the door, looked her straight in the eyes, and said one last thing to her. "I'm sorry, Miss Dewitt, but I will never give up on my son."